Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The night it happened, I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. I was on my regular patrol, just doing my job, when something changed. I remember the way the air felt, thick and cold. My flashlight was cutting through the dark in quick, sweeping motions as I walked along the trail. It was almost midnight. I had the whole stretch of road to cover before I could call it a night. I was tired, every muscle in my legs was burning, and I'd been longing for a cup of coffee and a warm bed since about 9 o'clock. But this was my job, and there was no way out of it. The woods stretched out for miles, and it was my responsibility to make sure no one got lost or it was hurt out here. The trail was narrow, winding between thick pines that almost completely blocked out the moonlight. The flashlight was all I had to keep me on the path. I kept moving forward, my boots crunching over leaves and twigs, the sound a steady rhythm in the empty dark. It was a sound I was used to, something that had always made me feel safe. That's how I knew I wasn't alone when I heard a different noise. It was subtle, just a branch snapping somewhere off to my left. I paused, turned my flashlight in that direction, and listened. Nothing, only silence. I shook my head, thinking it must have been a deer or maybe a raccoon, but something about it made me uneasy. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had this weird feeling like someone was watching me. I scanned the area again, my flashlight bouncing over the dense tree trunks. Still nothing. I tried to shrug it off and keep moving. Another few minutes passed, and that feeling didn't leave. It only got worse. The forest was unnaturally quiet. I know these woods. At night, they're supposed to be alive with sound. Crickets, owls, even the occasional coyote howl. But that night, it was dead silent. My own footsteps seemed too loud, and I found myself slowing down, almost tiptoeing, trying to hear something, anything other than my breathing and the crunch under my boots. Then, there it was again. A heavy snap, like something big had stepped on a branch. This time, it was closer and definitely deliberate. I stopped completely, turned my flashlight towards where I thought the sound had come from, and held my breath. The beam of light moved slowly, picking up nothing but trees and shadows. And then, there, just for a second, I caught movement. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart started pounding harder. I swear, there was something tall, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. It was moving, like it was walking between the trees, staying just out of sight. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was big. I tried to focus the light, but it was gone before I could make out any real details. I stood there for a long second, trying to make sense of it. My mind was racing. There aren't supposed to be bears here, not this deep in the park. Whatever it was, it walked on two legs, and it moved quickly, like it knew I was looking for it. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry, and realized I needed to keep moving. Standing still felt like a bad idea. If there was something out there, I didn't want to be an easy target. So I picked up the pace, my legs shaky as I forced myself along the trail. Every step felt heavier, my ears straining for more sounds behind me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, swinging the flashlight in wide arcs, but all I saw were shadows. It was like the darkness itself had eyes on me, pressing in from all directions. My breathing got faster, and I could feel sweat on the back of my neck, even though the air was cool. Then I heard it again, only this time it wasn't a branch breaking, it was footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, matching my pace, following just far enough away that I couldn't see who or what it was. My stomach twisted, and I felt a jolt of panic rush through me. I sped up, my feet slipping on the loose dirt of the trail, almost tripping as I tried to put more distance between me and whatever was out there. I didn't want to run. I knew better than to run in the dark, especially on a trail like this one. but my body wasn't listening to logic anymore. I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins, my instincts screaming at me to move faster, to get out of there. My flashlight beam bounced wildly with each step, and all I could hear was my own heart pounding in my ears, mixed with those heavy footsteps that kept following. And then I saw it again. Just for a split second, when I turned a corner in the trail and looked back, there, in the beam of my flashlight, was a figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, covered in something dark. It wasn't a person. It was too tall, too bulky. Its head almost seemed to reach the lower branches of the trees, and it moved with this strange kind of grace, like it was completely at home in the woods. I stumbled, my foot catching on a rock, and I hit the ground hard. Pain shot up through my knee, and I felt the flashlight slip from my hand, skidding a few feet away. For a moment, I was plunged into darkness, my breath catching in my throat as I scrambled to grab the flashlight. My fingers closed around it, and I turned it back on, my hand shaking so badly the light flickered. When I swung the flashlight back, the figure was gone. The trail was empty. My knee throbbed, and I struggled to get back to my feet, my head whipping around, trying to see where it had gone. I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore. It was like whatever had been following me had just vanished. I didn't wait to find out if it was still out there. I started moving again, limping slightly, my knee aching with each step. My only thought was getting back to the main road, back to my truck, where I could call for help if I needed to. The forest still felt wrong, too quiet, too empty, like everything else had hidden away. Every few seconds, I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to see it again. The flashlight beam seemed weaker now, like the darkness was closing in even more. I was breathing hard, my chest tight, the cold air stinging my lungs. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted, that whatever it was had simply stepped out of sight, waiting for the right moment. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the break in the trees where the trail met the road. I practically ran the last few yards, my boots sliding on the loose gravel, and burst out onto the open stretch of asphalt. I turned around, aiming my flashlight back into the woods, half expecting to see the figure standing there at the edge of the trees. But there was nothing, just darkness. The silence was heavy, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I stood there, my heart pounding, my whole body tense, waiting. After a long minute, I took a shaky breath and turned back towards my truck, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the keys. I got in, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, my eyes darting to the tree line. I still felt like I was being watched, like something was out there, just beyond the reach of the headlights. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life, and I didn't waste any time. I put the truck in gear and drove away, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I didn't look back. Whatever I'd seen out there, I didn't want to know if it was still watching me. I just wanted to get as far away from those woods as I could. I've been a park ranger for years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things. But that night was different. That wasn't just an animal, and it sure as hell wasn't another person. When I got back to the station, I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I knew what they'd say, that it was just a bear, or maybe my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark, but I know what I saw, and I know that I wasn't alone out there. Story 2. The night Ellen and I camped out in the Sierra Nevada, I woke up to the sound of something big moving outside our tent. It wasn't like any of those little noises you hear sometimes in the middle of the woods, like a squirrel scurrying past or a raccoon shuffling through the leaves. This was different. I blinked, trying to shake off the sleep, my body heavy from exhaustion. For a second I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps, right outside the tent. I reached over to Ellen, nudging her shoulder. "Ellen, wake up," I whispered, my voice just a breath. She stirred, her eyes barely opening, and muttered something incoherent. The footsteps continued, circling our tent. My heart thudded in my chest, and my mind instantly went to the worst-case scenario. Maybe it was a bear, but it didn't sound like a bear. Bears don't move like that. The sound was rhythmic, almost like a person walking. Do you hear that?" I whispered, my hand now gripping Ellen's arm a little harder. She blinked, finally waking up, and turned her head to listen. Her eyes widened, and I could see the same realization hit her. Those weren't normal forest sounds. She mouthed, "What is that?" I shook my head, signaling for her to stay quiet. I reached for the flashlight next to my sleeping bag, my fingers trembling slightly as I fumbled to find the switch. The footsteps paused, and I held my breath, my ears straining to pick up any sound, even the faintest rustle. It was dead quiet, and that was somehow even worse. The silence felt like it was pressing in on us, heavy and thick, making it hard to think. I clicked on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness inside the tent. I could see Ellen's face, pale and tense, her eyes wide. She nodded toward the tent flap, like she wanted me to unzip it, to take a look. I hesitated. My instincts were screaming at me that opening the tent was a terrible idea, but I knew we couldn't just sit there, waiting for whatever was outside to make the first move. Slowly, I shifted, my hand moving towards the zipper. Every little noise felt amplified. Ellen's breathing, the soft rustle of fabric, the faint metallic sound of the zipper sliding open inch by inch. I kept the flashlight pointed at the tent door, my hand shaking slightly, the beam quivering as I pulled the zipper down, just enough to peek outside. For a moment, I saw nothing but darkness. The trees loomed around us, their silhouettes barely visible against the starless sky. I swallowed, my throat dry, and leaned forward just a little more, trying to get a better look. Then there it was. Movement. Something big, just at the edge of the clearing, where the trees started to thicken. It was tall, much taller than a person, with broad shoulders and a mass that made the trees behind it seem small. My heart hammered in my chest, and I instinctively pulled back, my body reacting before my mind could even catch up. Ellen saw the look on my face, and her eyes went even wider, her mouth parting slightly in shock. "What did you see?" she mouthed, barely making a sound. I shook my head, bringing a finger to my lips, and mouthed back, "Not a bear." We both stayed like that for a minute, completely still, listening. The footsteps started again, slow and heavy, moving further away this time. I listened as they grew fainter, until they disappeared altogether into the forest. The silence came back, that same thick, unnatural quiet, but at least the footsteps were gone. I let out a shaky breath, realizing I'd been holding it for way too long. My chest ached, and my hands were trembling as I set the flashlight down. Ellen was staring at me, her face a mix of fear and confusion, and I knew she was waiting for me to say something, to tell her what to do, but I didn't know what to do. My mind was blank, just a jumble of instincts screaming at me to get out of there, to run, to leave everything behind if we had to. "We should go," Ellen whispered, her voice barely audible, but there was a sharp edge of fear to it. I nodded, swallowing hard, my throat still dry. I knew she was right. Staying out here felt like asking for trouble. Whatever that thing was, I didn't want to be around when it decided to come back. We moved slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. I reached for my boots, my fingers feeling clumsy as I tried to untangle the laces. Ellen was already slipping on her jacket, her eyes flicking back to the partially open tent flap every few seconds, like she was expecting to see that figure standing there, staring at us. My stomach was in knots, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I finally got my boots on, and Ellen grabbed her pack, moving carefully so as not to make the fabric rustle too much. I took the flashlight again, keeping the beam low, pointed at the ground as I slowly unzipped the tent the rest of the way. The night air rushed in, cold and biting against my face, and I shivered as I stepped out into the clearing. Everything looked the same as before, dark, quiet, the trees standing like silent sentinels around us. But I knew better. I knew something was out there. Something that wasn't supposed to be. Ellen stepped out behind me, and I could hear her breathing, shallow and quick. I turned, putting a finger to my lips again, and she nodded, her face tense. We started moving towards the trail that led back down the mountain, our footsteps soft against the dirt. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump, my heart skipping a beat. The flashlight beam flickered, and I felt a surge of panic, my thumb quickly pressing the switch back and forth until the light steadied again. Ellen was right behind me, her hand gripping the back of my jacket, her fingers tight and trembling. We hadn't gone far when I heard it again, a sound, distant but unmistakable. Footsteps, coming from somewhere behind us, moving slowly, deliberately, like whatever it was knew we were trying to leave. My stomach dropped, and I quickened my pace, my feet slipping slightly on the uneven ground. Ellen gasped, almost tripping, and I reached back, grabbing her arm to steady her. "Come on," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. We moved faster, our footsteps no longer careful, the only thought in my mind to get away, to put as much distance between us and whatever was out there as possible. The footsteps behind us grew louder, closer, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trail twisted and turned, the trees crowding in on either side, and I kept the flashlight pointed straight ahead, the beam bouncing with each step. My legs were aching, my knee twinging every time my foot hit an uneven patch of ground. But I didn't slow down. Suddenly, Ellen pulled on my jacket, yanking me to a stop. I turned, the flashlight swinging around wildly, and she pointed off the trail, her eyes wide and desperate. I followed her gaze and saw what she meant. A thick cluster of bushes, dense enough to hide us, if we could get in without making too much noise. I nodded, and we moved towards it, pushing our way into the underbrush, the branches scratching at my face and arms. We crouched down, huddled together, the flashlight off now, the darkness pressing in around us. I could feel Ellen's breath, quick and shallow against my shoulder, her fingers digging into my arm. The footsteps were closer now, moving along the trail we had just left. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting. The sound grew louder until it was right there, just beyond the bushes. I could barely see through the thick branches, but I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow passing between the trees, tall and massive, moving slowly like it was searching for something. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it could hear us, that any second now it would turn and find us hiding there. Ellen squeezed my arm, and I could feel her trembling, her whole body shaking against mine. I wanted to tell her it would be okay, that we'd get out of this, but I couldn't make myself speak. I just watched, barely daring to breathe, as the shadow moved past us, the footsteps growing fainter as it continued down the trail. We stayed there, crouched in the bushes, until the sound had completely faded, until all I could hear was the wind rustling through the leaves and Ellen's quiet, shaky breath. My legs were cramping, my knees aching from the awkward position, but I didn't move. I waited, counting the seconds in my head, my ears straining for any sign that it was coming back. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I shifted, slowly, carefully, and turned to Ellen. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and scared, but she nodded, understanding what I was about to say. We needed to move. We couldn't stay out here, not with that thing still somewhere in the woods. I turned the flashlight back on, keeping the beam low, and we crawled out of the bushes, our movements slow and deliberate. The trail was empty, the forest still quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whatever it was knew we were still out here. We started down the trail again, moving as quickly as we could without making too much noise. My body was aching, every muscle tired and sore, but I pushed forward, the only thought in my mind to get back to the safety of the car, to get away from these woods. Ellen was right behind me, her hand still gripping my jacket, her breaths coming in short, panicked bursts. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, each turn leading to another, the darkness never lifting, the trees never thinning. My heart was pounding, my chest tight with fear, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop, not until I saw the faint glimmer of the parking lot up ahead, the outline of the car barely visible in the darkness. We practically ran the last few yards, my fingers fumbling with the keys as we reached the car. I yanked the door open, Ellen climbing in beside me, and I slammed it shut, locking the doors as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition, but finally the engine roared to life, and I hit the gas, the tires skidding on the loose gravel as we sped away. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if it was still out there, standing at the edge of the parking lot, watching us leave. I just drove, the headlights cutting through the darkness, my hands tight on the wheel, my heart still pounding in my chest. Ellen was silent beside me, her face pale, her eyes staring straight ahead. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say. Whatever it was, whatever we had seen, we were just glad to be away from it. And I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't ever going back to those woods again. Story 3. I was just trying to get some peace. A solo hike was all I needed. No distractions, no noise, just the forest and me. But that day, something wasn't right, and I felt it before I even saw anything. The air was heavy, and everything felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but as I walked along that narrow trail in the woods of Washington State, I realized what was bothering me. The quiet, too quiet. It wasn't like the usual silence of the forest, where you could hear a bird here and there, maybe a breeze through the leaves. This was different, like every living thing had decided to hold its breath. I tried not to overthink it. I mean, sometimes the forest just gets like that, right? Maybe I was being paranoid. I took a deep breath and kept moving, my hiking boots crunching over the dried leaves and twigs underfoot. I remember looking up at the treetops, trying to spot a bird or anything, but there was nothing, no movement, no sound, just the sun filtering through the branches. After a while, I caught a whiff of something foul. It came out of nowhere, a stench that hit me like a punch to the gut, something rotten, like a mix of wet dog and garbage left out too long. I gagged, covering my nose and mouth with my hand. It was strong, and it felt like it was following me, lingering in the air around me as I kept walking. I was starting to think maybe an animal had died nearby, but the smell wasn't fading. It was getting stronger. I felt my skin prickle. That sense of being watched started creeping in, and I slowed down, trying to listen. Nothing, just the sound of my own footsteps, now cautious and hesitant. I glanced around, but all I saw were the same damn trees and shadows. But then, just for a second, I saw something move, something dark, up the hill to my right. My heart jumped, and I stopped in my tracks, my eyes straining to see better through the branches. It was just a silhouette, tall, almost blending into the shadows. It stood there, unmoving, and I stared at it. My breath caught in my throat. I thought it might be another hiker at first, but something about it wasn't right. Too tall, too broad, and it wasn't moving. My pulse was pounding in my ears, and I forced myself to take a step back. I kept my eyes on that figure, and for a second I wondered if my mind was playing tricks on me. But then it moved. Not a lot, just a small shift, like it was turning away from me. My chest tightened, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't wait to see more. I turned, started walking again, faster this time. I didn't care where I was headed, as long as it was away from that thing. My feet moved quickly over the uneven ground, and I kept looking back over my shoulder, expecting to see it following me. But there was nothing, just the empty trail and the trees. I told myself I was being ridiculous, probably just a shadow or a trick of the light, but that didn't make me feel any better. My gut was screaming at me to get out of there. The air was thick, hard to breathe, and that smell, God, it was everywhere. I tried to calm myself down, taking deep breaths through my nose, but it didn't help. My whole body was tense, my senses on high alert. Then I heard it, a branch snapping somewhere behind me. Not a small snap, but something heavy, like someone or something stepping on it. I froze, my hands shaking, my eyes wide as I slowly turned my head. There, through the trees, I saw movement again. The figure slipping between the trees, coming down the hill toward me. I didn't think, I just ran. I took off down the trail, my boots slamming against the dirt, my backpack bouncing against my shoulders. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, and I kept my eyes on the trail ahead, trying not to trip over the roots and rocks that seemed to pop up out of nowhere. I could hear it behind me, heavy footfalls, not quite running but moving fast, like it knew I was trying to get away. My lungs burned, and I pushed myself harder, my legs aching with each step. The trail twisted and turned, and I barely registered where I was going, just trying to put as much distance between me and that thing as I could. I could feel the sweat dripping down my back, my heart pounding in my chest, my ears, my head. I glanced over my shoulder, and I swear for just a second I saw it, tall, dark, moving through the trees. Its strides were long, covering the ground faster than I could. I almost stumbled, my foot catching on a root, but I managed to catch myself, my hands brushing against the dirt as I pushed forward again. There was no way I could outrun it. I could feel it gaining on me, every step closer, every breath I took more ragged, more desperate. My vision blurred with tears, and I blinked them away, my whole body screaming for me to stop, to rest. But I knew if I stopped, it would catch me, and I didn't want to find out what would happen if it did. Suddenly, the trail opened up. I burst into a small clearing, the sunlight blinding me for a moment. I skidded to a stop, my chest heaving as I looked around. There was nowhere to go, just more trees on the other side, the trail disappearing into the thick forest again. My eyes darted around, searching for anything, a place to hide, something to defend myself with. My hands closed around a fallen branch, thick and solid, and I held it in front of me, my knuckles white as I gripped it tight. My breaths were shallow, and I turned, my back to the clearing, my eyes on the trail I had just come from, waiting. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the pounding of my heart, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement, any hint that it was still following me. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity, and I stood there, my whole body tense, ready to swing the branch at anything that came out of those trees. And then nothing. The forest stayed quiet. No footsteps, no movement, no shadow slipping between the trees. Just nothing. I didn't dare move. I stayed there, the branch still held in front of me, my eyes darting around, searching the edge of the clearing. I knew it was out there. I could feel it, but it wasn't showing itself. Slowly, I backed away, my eyes never leaving the trees. My legs were shaking, my body aching from the sprint. But I kept moving, step by step, until I reached the other side of the clearing. The trail was there, leading back down the mountain. And I turned, keeping the branch in my hand as I started moving again. I walked quickly, my head turning back every few steps, my heart still pounding in my ears. The smell was fading now, and the further I got from that clearing, the easier it was to breathe. My steps were shaky, my legs weak, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Not until I was back at the trailhead, back at my car, back where I knew I'd be safe. When I finally reached the parking lot, I felt like I could collapse. My body was sore, my muscles aching, and I could barely catch my breath. I dropped the branch, my hands trembling as I fumbled for my keys. The parking lot was empty, my car the only one there, and I all but threw myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked the doors, my hands still shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I stared out the windshield, my eyes scanning the tree line, waiting for something to come out, to show itself. But there was nothing. Just the same quiet forest, the trees standing still, the breeze rustling through the leaves. I sat there for a long time, my heart slowly calming, my breathing evening out. I couldn't get the image of that figure out of my head, tall, dark, moving through the trees, always just out of sight. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't want to know. All I knew was that I wasn't coming back to these woods. Not alone. Not ever. I started the car, the engine roaring to life, and I put it in gear, my hands still trembling on the wheel. I drove away, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing at the edge of the parking lot, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the empty road, the forest disappearing behind me. I kept driving, not slowing down until I was miles away, until the trees were far in the distance, until the smell was gone, and the air felt light again. Only then did I finally let myself breathe. My hands relaxing on the wheel, my shoulders slumping. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't know if anyone would even believe me if I told them. But I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in those woods. And whatever was out there, it was something I never want to see again. Story 4. It was supposed to be a routine night shift. Just another round along the trail, checking on things. Nothing ever happened out there until that night. That night, everything changed. My name is Ethan, and I've been a forest ranger for about 8 years now. That night started like any other. I was alone, working the late shift, patrolling a trail that cuts deep into one of the most isolated parts of the reserve. I had done this 1,000 times. The forest at night doesn't scare me, at least it didn't. I've always thought of it as peaceful, almost calming. The usual mix of noises, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the chirping of crickets, and occasionally the hoot of an owl. That was the soundtrack to my work, and it made me feel like everything was under control. I was walking along the trail, my flashlight cutting through the dark. It was one of those moonless nights where the darkness felt heavy, almost like a blanket. I had reached the middle of the route, where the path dips down into a shallow valley surrounded by thick pines. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, echoing from somewhere behind me. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer. I turned my flashlight behind me, expecting to see nothing, just the trees. But the footsteps stopped as soon as I stopped moving. It was like whatever it was had been matching my pace. I stood there, shining the beam in a slow sweep from one side to the other, trying to catch a glimpse of anything moving. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I swallowed, trying to shake off a sudden chill that had crept up my spine. I took a breath, convincing myself it was probably just my imagination, or maybe an echo of my own steps bouncing off the trees. I kept walking, trying to ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. After a few minutes, I heard it again, those same footsteps following me. This time I didn't stop. I kept moving, my pace a little faster, my ears straining to hear any sound out of place. The footsteps picked up speed too. My heart started pounding. I felt that tightness in my chest, my breaths coming in shorter, sharper pulls. I wanted to turn and run, but I knew I couldn't do that. I had a job to do, and besides, running blindly in the dark was a good way to end up injured, or worse, lost. I forced myself to keep a steady pace, but my hands were sweaty, gripping the flashlight so hard my knuckles ached. I needed to know what was behind me. I stopped suddenly, spinning around and shining my light down the trail. For a second, I thought I saw something, a shadow, taller than a person, there at the edge of the light. It was just for a split second before it moved back, melting into the darkness. My mouth went dry. I strained my eyes, trying to see anything else, trying to make sense of it. It was too big to be a deer or even a bear. Bears don't move like that. They don't step quietly, pausing like they're studying you, and that shadow, it was upright, standing like a person. But it was bigger, broader, and there was something about the way it moved that set every instinct I had on edge. I started walking again, but this time I pulled out my radio, clicking it on. Base, this is Ranger Ethan. Over, I said, my voice low, trying not to let the fear creep in. There was a crackle of static and then silence. I tried again. Base, come in. I'm on the South Trail, and I think there's something out here. Over? More static. No response. The radio was dead. I swore under my breath, feeling the tension twisting tighter in my chest. I was on my own out here. The footsteps started again, this time faster, like whatever it was had realized I was trying to call for help. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot. It was getting closer. I didn't care about staying calm anymore. I started moving quickly, almost jogging, trying to keep my breathing under control, but the noise behind me only grew louder. I could feel it now, that presence, like eyes boring into my back. I broke into a full run. I didn't care about the trail. I just needed to put distance between me and whatever the hell was following me. My flashlight bounced with each step, the beam jerking wildly over the trees and bushes. My boots pounded against the dirt, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it behind me, heavy footfalls, branches snapping like toothpicks. It was faster than me, and it was closing the gap. Up ahead, I saw a break in the trees, a clearing. I ran for it, the open space, my only hope. I burst into the clearing, stumbling to a stop, spinning around with the flashlight raised. The footsteps stopped too. Everything went silent. The clearing was empty. Nothing moved. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, the shadows deep and endless at the edges of the clearing. I stood there, my chest heaving, trying to catch my breath. I felt exposed, standing in the open, the trees circling me like dark walls. I turned slowly, shining the light around, listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No breathing, just the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. Then at the edge of the clearing, just where the light faded into darkness, I saw it. A figure, tall and broad, half hidden behind a tree. It was watching me. I could just make out the outline, a head, shoulders, something that looked like an arm. It was covered in dark hair, blending in with the shadows. It didn't move, just stood there, staring. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the flashlight. I took a step back, then another. The figure stayed where it was, but I could feel its eyes on me, following my every move. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I turned and ran again, not looking back. My only thought to get as far away as possible. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station. I burst through the door, slamming it behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I locked it, leaning against the door, my whole body trembling. The station was empty. My partner was out on another trail. I grabbed the radio on the desk, fumbling with the dials, trying to get a signal. Base, this is Ethan. There's something out there. South Trail. I don't know what it is, but it's big. It's not a bear. It's not... My voice broke, and I had to swallow hard, trying to keep it together. I need backup. Over. The radio crackled. And then, finally, a voice came through. Ethan, this is Base. Copy that. Stay put. We're sending a team your way. Over. I sank into the chair, my hands still shaking, the radio clutched tightly in my grip. I kept my eyes on the windows, half expecting to see that figure standing there, watching me from the edge of the forest, but there was nothing, just darkness, and the faint rustle of the wind in the trees. The team arrived about 20 minutes later, but it felt like hours. They found me sitting there, still staring at the windows, my flashlight on the desk in front of me. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words felt hollow, like they couldn't capture the fear, the certainty that something had been out there, something that shouldn't exist. They searched the trail, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to prove that I hadn't imagined it all. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard, and I'm not the only one. Over the years, I've heard the stories, other rangers, hikers, people who've been out there in the dark and felt that same presence, seen that same shadow. I don't patrol the South Trail alone at night anymore. I always make sure there's someone else with me, and I always keep my flashlight close, my ears open for that sound, that heavy, deliberate step just out of sight. Because whatever it was, it's still out there, and I don't want to be alone when it decides to come closer. Story 5. I was out there early that morning, right at dawn, hoping to get the best light for photos, just me, my camera, and the quiet forest. But that morning turned out to be anything but normal. Something was out there watching me. My name is Claire, and I work as a freelance wildlife photographer. That morning, I was on a mission to capture some good shots of the local bird life. The early hours are usually the best. Everything is waking up, and the forest feels fresh, like it's breathing new life. I had parked my car at the entrance of the reserve, grabbed my gear, and walked in about a mile or so along one of the lesser-used trails. I set up my camera on a tripod near a clearing. The sun was just starting to filter through the trees, the light coming in like golden spears between the leaves. I was focused on a couple of blue jays, trying to get the right angle, making tiny adjustments to the focus, the kind of details that take all your attention. It was peaceful. Everything about that morning felt just right. The forest still and quiet, but full of that soft hum of life. Then I felt it, like a prickling at the back of my neck. The kind of feeling you get when someone's staring at you from across the room. I ignored it at first, trying to stay focused on my shot, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It grew stronger, almost insistent, like an itch under the skin. I pulled my eye away from the camera and looked around, just casually at first, not expecting to see anything. But there it was, in the corner of my eye, near the edge of the clearing. Something was moving between the trees. I turned my head slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements, trying not to startle whatever it was. I thought maybe it was a deer, but when I looked more closely, I saw that it was standing upright. It was big, a lot bigger than a person. I could see dark, shaggy hair, thick, and a head that seemed almost too high up, like it was standing at least a foot or two taller than any human I'd ever seen. It wasn't close, maybe 50 feet away, but it was enough for me to feel that jolt of fear in my stomach. My pulse kicked up instantly, thudding in my ears, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't move. I stayed frozen, just staring, my fingers gripping the edge of my camera so tightly they ached. My heart pounded so loud I could almost hear it. The thing, it was just standing there, partly behind a tree, not moving either. It was watching me. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel it, like a weight pressing against me. A few seconds passed, or maybe it was longer. Time felt weird, stretched out and slow. My brain was working overtime, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, trying to find a box to put it in, bear. But no, it wasn't shaped like a bear, it wasn't on all fours, and the way it was standing, it wasn't right. My gut told me it was something else. I slowly started to lower my camera, trying to reach for my phone, thinking I needed a picture of this. Proof. But as soon as I moved, it shifted too. I saw it take a step back, almost disappearing behind the tree, like it was hiding. That did it. My instincts screamed at me, my body tensing all at once. I needed to get out of there. I didn't want to turn my back on it, but I also didn't want to stand there waiting to see what it would do. I packed my gear as quickly as I could without taking my eyes off that spot. I kept glancing up, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the tripod, trying to fold it up. Every time I looked up, I half expected it to be gone, or worse, closer. It didn't move any closer, though. It stayed right there behind that tree, just watching. I could see its shape, the bulk of it, the way it was barely visible in the dim light under the trees. There was something about that stillness, something that felt wrong. Animals don't act like that. Bears might come close out of curiosity, but they don't stand there silently, studying you like that. Finally, I had my gear packed. My pulse was racing, my mouth was dry, and I felt sweat trickling down my back despite the cool morning air. I took a step backward, then another, slowly, keeping my eyes on that spot. I could still see it, just standing there, and I swear in that moment it leaned slightly to the side, like it was trying to keep me in view. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and started walking fast, my footsteps crunching loudly on the trail. I tried not to run, but every muscle in my body was screaming at me to move, to get as far away from that thing as possible. My camera bag bounced against my hip, the weight making it harder to keep a steady pace, but I didn't care. I just needed to get back to the car. I was about halfway back when I heard something. It was faint but unmistakable, the sound of branches snapping somewhere behind me. I risked a glance over my shoulder, my heart in my throat. I didn't see anything, but I knew it was there. It was following me, keeping its distance, but moving through the trees, staying out of sight. My legs felt weak, and my breath was coming in short, ragged bursts. I forced myself to keep moving, my eyes fixed on the trail ahead, looking for the familiar shape of my car. The forest around me felt too quiet, like everything else had stopped making noise. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of my own footsteps and, every now and then, the soft crack of something moving in the distance. Finally, I saw it. The glint of sunlight off the roof of my car, parked just up ahead. I broke into a jog, not caring anymore if it hurt me, just wanting to get to safety. I reached the car, fumbling with my keys, my fingers shaking so badly I almost dropped them. I unlocked the door, yanked it open, and threw myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me. For a moment, I just sat there, breathing hard, my hands still gripping the steering wheel even though the car wasn't on. I looked out through the windshield, back toward the trail, half expecting to see that thing standing there, watching me from the edge of the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty path, the forest still and quiet. I started the car, my hands still trembling, and backed out of there as fast as I could. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, the feeling of being watched still heavy in my chest. I didn't slow down until I was miles away, back on the main road, the forest fading into the distance behind me. Even now, I can't fully explain what I saw. I've spent years photographing wildlife. I know the animals in these woods, their behaviors, their patterns. This wasn't anything I recognized. It wasn't curious like a bear. It wasn't skittish like a deer. It was something else. Something that stood there, watching me, like it understood I didn't belong there. Since that day, I haven't gone back to that trail. I stick to more populated areas now, places where I know there are other people around. I still go out early, still chase that perfect light, but there's a part of me that's different now, more cautious, always listening, always aware of what might be watching from the shadows. I know some people would say it was just my imagination, that I saw a bear or some other animal and let my fear get the better of me, but I know what I saw. I know how it felt to be there, standing in that clearing with something big and dark watching me, studying me. Whatever it wasn't just an animal, it was something else, and it knew I was there. Story 6. I've been a logger for 20 years, and there's not much out in the woods that can faze me. I've seen bears, wolves, and even the occasional cougar prowling around, but nothing could have prepared me for that day in the deep Canadian woods. It was late in the afternoon, and we were working our way through a patch of old growth in the middle of nowhere. The rest of the crew was spread out across the area, each working their chainsaws, the roar echoing through the trees. I was finishing up a cut when I heard something off. It wasn't anything mechanical. Something about the rhythm felt wrong. It was this distant knocking sound, like someone hitting a thick branch against a tree, over and over, echoing through the forest. I turned my saw off and pulled off my earmuffs, the sudden silence leaving my ears ringing. I stood there, listening, trying to figure out what it was. The knocking wasn't like anything I'd ever heard out here. It was slow, rhythmic, and deliberate. I glanced around, expecting to see one of the guys messing around, but I didn't see anyone nearby. The nearest crew member was a good 50 yards away, his back turned to me, focused on his own work. I yelled out, "Hey, anyone hear that?" but no one responded. The sound of the other chainsaws was too loud, drowning out my voice. I frowned, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my gut. I wasn't a guy who got spooked easily, but there was something about that sound that made me feel uneasy, like I wasn't alone. I grabbed my radio from my belt, clicking the button. "Hey, anyone out there making that knocking noise?" I waited, but all I got back was static and the garbled sound of someone else working. I shook my head and decided to check it out myself. It was probably just an animal, maybe a woodpecker, though it sounded too heavy for that. I left my saw where it was and started walking towards the direction of the sound. The knocking kept going, steady and slow. As I moved further from the site, the forest grew quieter, the noise of the chainsaws fading into the background until all I could hear was the crunch of my boots on the forest floor. The sound was definitely coming from up ahead, deeper into the woods, where the trees were even thicker. I could feel the air grow colder as I stepped into the shade, the tall pines blocking out most of the late afternoon light. I kept walking, my eyes scanning the trees, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. The knocking was getting louder, more distinct, and my unease only grew. I stopped, looking around, my breath coming out in small clouds in the cool air. And then I saw it, movement between the trees, something big. My heart skipped a beat. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. It was maybe 100 feet away, partially hidden by the thick trunks. It wasn't a bear. Whatever it was stood upright, tall, its silhouette broad and covered in dark fur. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing to figure out what the hell I was looking at. It was knocking a branch against a tree, long, slow strikes, the sound echoing through the woods. I took a step back, my foot snapping a twig beneath me. The sound seemed to cut through the air, way too loud, and the figure stopped. It turned its head, and for a second I saw its face, a glimpse of dark eyes deep set beneath a heavy brow. My stomach dropped, and I felt a rush of cold fear like nothing I'd ever felt before. The thing stared at me for a long second, and then it just turned and walked away, slipping between the trees, moving deeper into the forest. I stood there, my heart pounding, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what to do. My instincts were screaming at me to get the hell out of there, but my legs felt like they were glued to the ground. I forced myself to move, taking a shaky breath and turning around. I started walking back the way I'd come, my steps quick and unsteady. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see it following me, but there was nothing there, just the trees and the shadows, and the distant sound of chainsaws from the rest of the crew. When I got back to the site, I felt like I could finally breathe again. The noise of the saws, the sight of the other guys working, it all felt almost surreal, like I was stepping back into a different world. I walked over to where Henrik was working, my hands still shaking as I picked up my saw. He looked up, giving me a nod, then frowned when he saw my face. "You all right, man?" he yelled over the roar of his saw. I just nodded, trying to shake off the fear that still clung to me. "Yeah," I shouted back, my voice rough. "Just thought I saw something. Probably nothing." But I knew it wasn't nothing. Whatever it was real, and it was out there, somewhere in those woods. The rest of the day passed in a blur, the noise of the saws filling the silence, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. That silhouette, the knocking, the way it had stared at me. When we finally packed up for the day, I was the first one ready to leave. I threw my gear into the back of the truck, my eyes scanning the tree line, looking for any sign of movement. Henrik climbed into the passenger seat, giving me a look. "You sure you're good? You seem jumpy." I forced a smile, shaking my head. "Yeah, just ready to get out of here," I said, starting the engine. I didn't look back as we drove away, the forest fading into the distance behind us. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. Those dark eyes staring at me through the trees. The rhythmic knocking, echoing in my head. I knew I wouldn't forget that sound for a long time, and I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that part of the woods alone. Not ever. Story 7. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The kind of silence that makes your skin prickle, that makes you feel like you shouldn't be there. I was on patrol that night, making my rounds through a stretch of forest not far from the station. I had done this route 100 times before, nothing special, nothing out of the ordinary, but that night there was something different about it. The fog had rolled in heavy, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of me. My flashlight beam barely cut through it, the dense mist swallowing the light, making everything look blurry. It was getting late, and I was just trying to get it over with, finish my rounds, and head back to the warmth of the station. But as I moved through the fog, that feeling of being watched started to creep in. I stopped, shining the flashlight around me, turning in a slow circle. Nothing, just trees, a wall of fog, and that damn silence. Usually the forest is full of noise, even at night. Crickets, rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. But there was nothing. I could hear my own breathing, loud in my ears, and the crunch of leaves under my boots as I shifted my weight. Then I caught something. 2 eyes reflecting the light from my flashlight. They were just hanging there in the fog, far enough away that I couldn't make out what they were attached to. My heart skipped a beat, my hand tightening around the flashlight. It didn't look like the eyes of a deer or a raccoon. They were too high off the ground, too still, staring right at me. I swallowed, the back of my throat dry. I took a step forward, and the eyes blinked, disappearing for a second, then reappearing, still fixed on me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice louder than I meant. It echoed strangely, muffled by the fog. I heard nothing in return, just silence. The eyes didn't move, just watched. My pulse started to pick up, my gut telling me something was wrong. Animals usually run when they see a person, but this thing wasn't moving. I took another step, and the eyes finally shifted, dipping low, then disappearing altogether. The fog was too thick to see anything beyond a few feet, and I strained my ears, listening. I heard something, a soft crunch, like a footstep, careful and slow. My fingers were sweaty around the flashlight now, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my neck. It wasn't an animal. Whatever it was moving deliberately, quietly, like it didn't want to be seen. I turned, pointing my flashlight in the direction of the sound, the beam cutting a narrow path through the fog. Nothing. The light bounced off the mist, giving everything a ghostly look. I felt my stomach twist, that instinctive gut-deep fear kicking in. Something was out there, and it was close. My whole body was tense, my muscles tight, ready to bolt. Another step. Closer now. I swung the flashlight again, my hand shaking. My breath caught in my throat as I caught sight of it. Tall, dark, the silhouette almost blending in with the shadows. It was upright, standing on 2 legs, and it moved smoothly, like it knew the forest better than I did. I felt a jolt of panic shoot through me, my hands suddenly clammy. I backed up, my boots crunching on the leaves, my heart racing. The figure moved, slipping between the trees, keeping just at the edge of my flashlight beam. I could hear my breath, fast and shallow, each exhale clouding in front of my face in the cold night air. I had to get out of there. My mind was screaming it, the fear washing over me in waves. Whatever this was, it wasn't something I wanted to face alone, not out here in the dark. I turned and started walking fast, almost jogging, the flashlight bouncing with each step. The fog swirling around me. I could hear it behind me, soft footsteps following me, never too far, just out of sight. I tried not to look back, my focus on the trail ahead, the dim path barely visible in the dark. My breath was loud in my ears, my lungs burning from the cold air. I didn't know if it was getting closer, but I couldn't bring myself to stop and find out. The footsteps behind me sped up, and that was it. I broke into a full run, my boots slipping on the uneven ground, my flashlight beam jumping wildly as I sprinted down the trail. Branches scraped at my arms, the cold air cutting into my throat, but I didn't care. All I could think was that I needed to get away, get back to the station, somewhere safe, anywhere but here. The fog made it hard to see, and I almost tripped, catching my foot on a root. I stumbled, barely managing to keep my balance, my heart slamming in my chest. I could hear it now, the thing behind me, the footsteps heavy and fast, getting closer. My panic was rising, my whole body screaming in fear, my mind blank except for that instinct to keep moving. Up ahead, I saw a break in the trees, the edge of the clearing where I knew the station was. Relief flooded through me, and I pushed myself harder, my legs aching, my lungs on fire. I burst out of the trees, the station a dark shape against the fog, and I ran for the door, my fingers fumbling for the keys at my belt. The footsteps stopped. I didn't dare look back. I jammed the key into the lock, twisting it with shaking hands, throwing the door open and slamming it shut behind me. My breath came in gasps, and I leaned against the door, my heart racing, my whole body trembling. The station was dark, the only light coming from the small lamp on the desk. I stood there, listening, trying to hear anything from outside. The silence was thick, pressing in on me, and I strained my ears, waiting for the sound of footsteps, a knock at the door, anything. But there was nothing, just that same oppressive quiet. I finally moved away from the door, my legs shaky, my hands still trembling as I set the flashlight down on the desk. My mind was racing, replaying what I had seen. That dark shape, those eyes staring at me, following me through the fog. I didn't know what it was, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I checked the locks, making sure the door was secure, then grabbed the radio, my fingers still clumsy. I called in, my voice shaky, telling them I needed someone to come out, that something was out there. The static crackled, and I waited, my breath catching in my throat, my eyes darting to the window, half expecting to see a face staring back at me. But there was nothing. Just darkness and fog. The voice on the other end finally crackled back, telling me they were on their way, to sit tight. I put the radio down, my hands still shaking, and sank into the chair. My whole body aching from the run, the adrenaline still pumping through me. I kept my eyes on the window, my ears straining for any sound, every muscle tense. Minutes felt like hours, the silence stretching on, and I couldn't shake that feeling of being watched, of something just outside, waiting. I kept the flashlight close, my fingers brushing against it, ready to grab it if I needed to. The fog pressed against the window, thick and heavy, and I stared into it, my breath shallow, my heart still pounding. Finally, headlights cut through the fog, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I stood up, my legs still shaky, and moved to the door, unlocking it just as I heard the truck pull up outside. The door opened, and I saw the familiar faces of my colleagues, their eyes widening when they saw my face. "You all right?" one of them asked, his voice filled with concern. I just shook my head, my mouth dry, and gestured towards the woods. "Something's out there," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know what, but it was following me." They exchanged a glance, and I could see the doubt in their eyes, but they nodded. "We'll check it out," one of them said, his hand resting on my shoulder for a moment. "You stay here, get some rest." I nodded, but I knew rest wasn't going to come easy. Not after what I'd seen. They headed back out into the fog, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, and I stood in the doorway, watching them disappear into the trees. I stayed there, my eyes scanning the edge of the clearing, waiting for any sign of movement. That feeling of being watched still clinging to me. The fog swallowed them, and I was alone again, the silence settling in around me. I closed the door, locking it tight, and sat back down, the flashlight still close at hand. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going back into that fog. Not alone, not until I knew it was gone. Story 8. The river was supposed to be a quiet place. Just me and my fishing rod, nothing else. But then that smell hit me, and I knew almost instantly that something was very, very wrong. My name's Simon, and I've been coming to this spot for years. It's one of those hidden places, a little corner of the forest where the river bends just right, with deep pools perfect for fishing. Nobody bothers you here, and that's exactly how I like it. I parked my old truck at the end of the trail, grabbed my gear, and made my way down to the water. The morning was cool, a little fog still clinging to the river, the kind of quiet where you can hear every bird, every rustle in the trees. I set up on a flat rock that juts out over the water, unpacking my bait, fixing my line. I was just getting settled in, tossing the first cast, watching the line fly out and settle into the river with that soft, satisfying splash. Everything felt normal. Just the sounds of the water flowing, birds calling now and then from the treetops, the occasional splash of something small breaking the surface. Peaceful. The kind of morning I always hope for when I come out here. Then, maybe 20 minutes in, I noticed it. This smell, it came out of nowhere, thick, heavy, like a mix of wet dog and something rotten. I wrinkled my nose, looking around, thinking maybe something had died nearby, some animal carcass. But it wasn't like anything I'd ever smelled before. It was foul, and it seemed to cling to the air, almost getting stronger by the second. I felt my stomach twist a little, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, just trying to make sense of it. Nothing was there, just the trees, the brush, everything quiet. Too quiet. The birds had stopped calling. I hadn't noticed until then, but the usual forest noise had dropped off, like somebody had flipped a switch. No rustling, no movement, just that awful smell. I turned back to the water, trying to shake it off, trying to focus. Probably a dead animal, I told myself, maybe upwind somewhere, but I couldn't get comfortable. My skin was prickling, that feeling you get when something's not right, when you know you're not alone even though you can't see anyone. I kept my eyes on the trees, my fingers tight around the rod. That's when I saw it. Across the river, maybe 30 yards out, something moved between the trees. I caught it out of the corner of my eye, just a flicker of dark, something big. I turned my head, squinting into the shadows, but it was already gone. My heart started to pick up speed, thumping in my chest. It was too big to be a deer, and the way it moved. There was something off about it. It wasn't like an animal. It was deliberate. I stared across the water, my eyes scanning the underbrush, the thick pines lining the far bank. I couldn't see anything now, but that smell was still there, stronger, almost making my eyes water. My fingers felt numb around the handle of my rod, and I could hear my own breath, shallow, like my body was bracing for something. Then I saw it again. This time it was clearer. A figure, tall, upright, covered in dark hair. It was there just for a second, slipping between two trees, and then it was gone again, like it was moving deeper into the woods. My mouth went dry. I could feel my pulse in my neck, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. It was watching me. I knew that. I could feel it in my bones. I didn't know what it was, but it was there, keeping an eye on me from the shadows. I tried to swallow, but my throat was tight, my brain racing, trying to figure out what to do. Running didn't feel like an option. I had all my gear, and the river was in front of me, nowhere easy to go. But staying there, just waiting, that felt worse. I slowly started reeling in my line, my eyes never leaving the far bank. My hands were shaking, the line slipping a bit, my fingers stiff. I could still see movement, glimpses of dark fur, just beyond the reach of the sunlight filtering through the branches. It wasn't coming closer, but it wasn't leaving either. It was circling, like it was trying to decide what I was, if I was a threat, or maybe something else. I finally got my line reeled in, and I stood up, my legs feeling shaky, like they might give out if I moved too fast. I grabbed my tackle box, shoving it all in without caring if it was neat, my eyes flicking back to the trees every few seconds. I needed to leave now, before it got any closer. I took a deep breath, then started backing away, keeping my eyes on the forest, my boots slipping a little on the damp rock. The figure moved again, just a flash, and I caught sight of its face, or at least what I thought was its face. It was broad, flat, with eyes that seemed too dark, almost blending in with the fur, and it was watching me. There was no doubt about that. I turned and started moving faster, almost stumbling as I got back onto the trail that led up to where my truck was parked. The smell was still there, hanging heavy in the air, and I could hear my own breathing, harsh and loud, drowning out everything else. My back was crawling, that awful feeling like something might reach out and grab me at any second. I made it up the trail, my boots crunching on the gravel, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold onto my gear. I could still hear the occasional snap of branches from behind me, and I didn't dare look back. I knew it was following, just out of sight, staying in the cover of the trees. When I finally saw my truck, I almost ran for it. I tossed my gear into the back, my fingers fumbling with the door handle, cursing under my breath until I finally got it open. I climbed in, slamming the door behind me, locking it without even thinking. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. I started the engine, the roar breaking the silence, and I backed out fast, gravel kicking up under the tires. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw it, a shape, standing at the edge of the trail just where the trees started. Tall, dark, just watching as I drove away. But then it was gone, swallowed up by the forest. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the main road, the forest far behind me. My hands were still trembling on the wheel, my chest tight, that smell still lingering in my nose like I couldn't shake it. I knew what I saw wasn't just some bear or a trick of the light. It was something else, something that didn't belong out there. Or maybe it did, and I was the one who didn't. I haven't been back to that spot since. I still fish, but not there. Not anywhere near that part of the river. There's something in those woods, something that watches, and I don't ever want to be on the other side of that stare again. Story 9, it should have been a straightforward hunt. The kind of day where you pack up your gear, head into the woods, and hope for a clean shot. That day, I was tracking a deer. I had been following its tracks for the better part of the morning, the fresh prints marking a clear path along the soft forest floor. But then, out of nowhere, those tracks stopped. I knelt down, frowning, brushing my fingers over the earth where the hoofprints simply ended. It was like the animal had vanished into thin air. No more tracks, no sign of struggle, no indication it had turned off the path. My gut twisted with that odd feeling, the kind you get when something doesn't add up. I stood up, my eyes scanning the area, looking for anything that could tell me what had happened. The forest was still. The air was thick, cool, with that damp smell of earth and pine. I looked up, turning slowly in place, my eyes moving from tree to tree. And that's when I saw them, marks on the trunks, deep gouges, high up, higher than any bear could reach. They were fresh, the raw wood bright against the bark. I took a step closer, squinting. It looked like something had clawed at the tree, but the width of the marks, the spacing, it didn't match anything I knew. The birds had gone quiet. That's when I really noticed. No rustling in the underbrush, no chirping from the branches above, just the sound of my own breathing, the crunch of leaves under my boots. It was wrong. I've hunted these woods enough times to know how they should sound, how they should feel, and right then everything felt off. I decided to move on, keeping my rifle ready, the butt snug against my shoulder. The trail was gone, but I kept walking, slow and careful, my eyes darting between the trees. I didn't like the idea of being out there without a clear path, but I wasn't about to leave empty-handed either. The woods were dense, the light filtering through the canopy, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch forever. After a few minutes, I heard it, a crack, sharp, somewhere to my left. My whole body tensed, my finger sliding to the trigger. I swung around, the rifle up, pointing in the direction of the sound. I held my breath, listening, straining my ears for any hint of movement. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy. Then another sound, this one closer, a rustling, like something moving slowly through the brush. My heart picked up, my pulse pounding in my ears. I aimed, squinting into the gloom, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. For a second I thought I saw it, a shadow, tall, shifting just beyond the reach of the sunlight. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice rough. It echoed, the sound carrying through the empty woods. No answer. My hands were starting to sweat, and I adjusted my grip on the rifle, my eyes scanning the area. Everything was still, but that feeling was growing, like I wasn't alone, like something was watching me. I took a step back, my boot crunching on a dry branch, the sound too loud in the quiet. I flinched, my gaze snapping to the ground, then back up again, sweeping the area. The shadow was gone. My stomach twisted, a jolt of fear running through me. I wasn't about to stick around and wait for whatever it was to show itself again. I turned, moving quickly now, not quite running but not exactly taking my time either. I kept the rifle ready, the muzzle pointed down but easy to bring up if I needed it. I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, my shirt sticking to my skin. Every few steps, I'd glance over my shoulder, just a quick look. But each time I saw nothing, just trees, thick and quiet. After a while, I came to a clearing, a wide, open space with tall grass and a few scattered boulders. I paused at the edge, my breath coming hard, and looked around. The light was better here, the fog of the forest not as thick. I let out a breath, some of the tension easing from my shoulders. It felt safer, being out in the open where I could see. I moved into the clearing, keeping to the edge, my eyes still scanning the tree line. But then I saw them. Footprints, huge, deep imprints in the soft earth, each one at least twice the size of my own boot. They weren't human, and they weren't anything I recognized. My mouth went dry, and I knelt down, brushing my fingers over the edge of one of the prints. The shape was strange, like a human foot, but wider, with toes that were too long. I looked up, my eyes following the trail of prints as they led across the clearing, disappearing into the trees on the other side. My heart pounded, and I felt that fear clawing its way back, my instincts screaming at me to leave, to get out of there now. A sound behind me, a branch snapping, followed by a low rustling. I spun around, the rifle coming up, my finger tight on the trigger. I saw it this time, a figure, tall and broad, slipping between the trees just at the edge of my vision. It moved fast, too fast for me to get a good look. I caught a flash of dark fur, a glimpse of something that looked almost like a face, but it was gone before I could make sense of it. My mouth went dry, and I felt a jolt of pure panic. I turned and started to run. I didn't care about the trail, didn't care where I was headed, as long as it was away from that thing. The clearing blurred around me as I sprinted, the grass whipping at my legs, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I hit the tree line, plunging back into the forest, the shadows swallowing me up. Branches clawed at my arms, my face, but I didn't stop. I could hear it behind me, heavy footfalls, crashing through the underbrush, always just a few steps behind. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I forced myself to keep moving, the fear pushing me forward, keeping me from slowing down. I stumbled, my foot catching on a root, and went down hard, my shoulder slamming into the ground. The rifle slipped from my hands, skidding away into the leaves. Pain shot through my arm, and I gritted my teeth, scrambling to get up. My eyes darted around, searching for the rifle, but I couldn't see it. I could hear the footsteps getting closer, the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs. I pushed myself to my feet, my head spinning, and took off again. I could barely think, my mind a blur of panic and pain. I knew I had to get to higher ground, somewhere I could see, somewhere that thing couldn't follow me. I could hear my own breathing, harsh and ragged, mixing with the sound of whatever was chasing me. Up ahead, I saw a rocky outcrop, the grey stone standing out against the trees. I made for it, my legs screaming, my body on the edge of giving out. I reached the base and scrambled up, my fingers finding holes in the rough stone, my boots slipping on the moss-covered surface. I pulled myself up, one hand over the other, my muscles burning, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I made it to the top, collapsing onto the flat surface, my chest heaving. I rolled over, looking back down at the forest below. I couldn't see it anymore, but I could hear it, the heavy footsteps slowing, stopping just at the edge of the rocks. My eyes scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Just the dark shapes of the trees, the shadows deep and impenetrable. I stayed there, my back pressed against the stone, my breath finally starting to slow. The pain in my shoulder throbbed, and I could feel the scratches on my arms stinging, the blood warm against my skin. I didn't move. I didn't dare. The silence had returned. That thick, heavy quiet, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Minutes passed, then more. Slowly, I pushed myself up, wincing at the pain in my shoulder. I looked around, my eyes scanning the forest below. I still couldn't see it, but I knew it was there, somewhere, watching. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think, to focus. I needed to get out of these woods, needed to get back to my truck, back to safety. I climbed down the other side of the rocks, moving slow, careful not to make too much noise. My body was sore, every muscle aching, but I kept moving. I kept my eyes on the tree line, every rustle of leaves, every shift of shadows making my heart skip a beat. I didn't know what I had seen, didn't want to know. All I wanted was to get out, to leave this place behind. The trek back to the trailhead felt like it took hours. The sun was dipping low, the light fading, and with it came the cold. I kept my pace steady, my breath fogging in the cool air, my ears straining for any sound, any hint that it was still following me. The woods were still too quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, that makes you feel like you're not alone. When I finally saw the road, the sight of my truck parked just where I left it, I almost cried out in relief. I broke into a jog, my legs protesting with every step, and reached the truck, yanking the door open and climbing inside. I locked the doors, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys, the engine roaring to life. I didn't look back as I pulled away, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel. I didn't want to see if it was standing there, watching me leave. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in short gasps, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. All I knew was that I was never coming back to these woods, not alone, not ever. Story 10. It was supposed to be a simple hike, just a way to clear my head before the sun dipped below the horizon. I thought I knew the forest well enough. Turns out, I was wrong. Something was out there, and I could feel it before I even saw anything. My name is Maria, and I usually hike alone. It gives me peace, time to think, to feel like I'm getting away from all the noise of life. That evening, I decided to take the West Trail, a route I knew pretty well. The sun was just about to set, the sky starting to turn a deep orange, and I thought I had enough time to make it to the overlook before dark. I had a flashlight in my pack, just in case, but I planned to be out before it got pitch black. I walked at a steady pace, my boots crunching softly on the dirt and leaves beneath me. Everything seemed fine at first. The usual sounds of the forest were all around me, birds chirping, the distant rustle of branches when the wind picked up. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just watching my steps, occasionally glancing up to see the path ahead. Then I heard something. It wasn't a loud noise, just a soft rustling off to the right, somewhere in the trees. I stopped, turning my head towards the sound. It wasn't unusual for animals to be around, but something about it made me pause. The forest suddenly felt quieter, like the usual buzz had dulled down. I couldn't see anything at first, just the dense brush and shadows, but I felt this tightness in my chest, that instinct that tells you something isn't quite right. I shrugged it off, started walking again, trying to ignore the strange feeling, but then it happened again. Rustling, this time closer, and it felt deliberate, like it was matching my movements. I froze, my eyes scanning the undergrowth. The light was fading faster now, and the shadows were growing, the kind of light where everything looks like it's moving out of the corner of your eye. I stood there for a moment, just listening. The air was still, and I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick. My skin prickled with unease, my pulse starting to pick up. I turned my head slowly, looking around, and that's when I saw it. Something moved between the trees. Not far off the trail, a figure dark, taller than any person I'd expect to see out here. It was just for a second, a flash of movement, then gone. My stomach dropped. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe just a trick of the light, but I knew better. My hands felt clammy, and I adjusted my grip on the hiking stick I had with me. It wasn't much, but in that moment, it felt like the only thing between me and whatever was out there. I started moving again, this time faster, trying to keep my eyes on the trail but also glancing to the sides, trying to catch any more movement. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, and I knew I had to keep it together. The overlook wasn't far, and I told myself that if I could just get there, maybe I'd be able to see whatever was out there clearly. I kept walking, but every few steps, I heard it. Footsteps, just off the trail, mirroring mine. They were heavy, deliberate, crunching on the leaves and twigs, staying just out of sight. I wanted to run, but I knew better. Running meant panic, and I couldn't afford to panic. I focused on my breathing, trying to keep it steady, even though every nerve in my body was telling me to get out of there as fast as I could. The sky was getting darker, and I could barely see the path now, just a strip of lighter ground leading me forward. My fingers fumbled for my flashlight, pulling it out, the beam shaky as I turned it on. The light cut through the dimness, bouncing off the trees. I shined it to the right, towards where I'd seen the movement. Nothing, just trees, branches swaying slightly in the breeze. I kept the light on, moving it slowly back and forth as I walked, trying to catch anything out of place. Then, ahead of me, maybe 20 yards down the trail, I saw it, a shape, standing just at the edge of the flashlight's beam. Tall, broad, covered in something dark, almost blending in with the shadows. It was standing upright, and it was facing me. My throat went dry, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my chest. The figure didn't move, just stood there, like it was waiting. I stopped dead, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I couldn't make out its face, couldn't see any details, but I could feel its eyes on me. My legs felt weak, like they might give out if I tried to move, but I knew I couldn't stay there. Slowly, I started backing up, my eyes locked on the shape. My breath was coming in shallow gasps now, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back, my whole body tense. The figure took a step forward, and I felt a jolt of fear shoot through me, my muscles tensing, ready to bolt. I turned then, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I started to run. I didn't care about staying calm anymore. I just needed to get away. My feet pounded on the trail, the sound of my own breathing drowning everything else out. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if it was following me. I ran until I could see the parking area through the trees, the faint glint of my car in the dim light. My chest burned, my legs aching, but I didn't stop. I burst out of the trail, stumbling slightly as I hit the gravel. I made a beeline for my car, fumbling for the keys in my pocket, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. I yanked the door open, throwing myself inside and slamming it shut. I locked the doors, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my eyes scanning the tree line. I half expected to see that figure standing there at the edge of the forest, but there was nothing. Just darkness, the trees swaying slightly in the breeze. I started the car, the engine roaring to life, and I backed out of there as fast as I could, my tires skidding slightly on the gravel. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart still hammering in my chest. For a second, I thought I saw something, a shadow, moving at the edge of the lot, just where the trees began, but then it was gone, swallowed up by the darkness. I didn't slow down until I was miles away, the forest far behind me, the road stretching out ahead. My hands were still trembling on the wheel, my whole body tense. The image of that figure burned into my mind. I don't know what it was, and I don't think I want to know. All I know is that something was out there, something that shouldn't have been, and it was watching me. Since that night, I haven't gone back to that trail. I still hike, but only during the day, and only on well-used paths where I know there are other people around. The forest isn't the same for me anymore. There's a part of me that's always listening now, always waiting for that sound. The crunch of footsteps in the brush, the sense that I'm not alone, because I know deep down that whatever was out there that night is still there somewhere, and I never want to be alone in those woods again. Story 11. My brother Matt and I had planned this camping trip for weeks. We were heading deep into the Alaskan backcountry, far enough from the nearest town that we wouldn't see a soul for days. We wanted solitude, time away from work, phones, people, just us, a campfire, and the wild. But that night I realized just how alone we were, and how dangerous that could be. It was past midnight, and I was lying in the tent, half awake, with Matt snoring softly beside me. The campfire outside had died down hours ago, leaving just the glow of embers barely visible through the mesh of the tent flap. I remember staring at the faint light, trying to drift off, when I noticed something that made my eyes snap wide open. Silence. There wasn't a single sound outside. Not a cricket, not the wind. Nothing. I turned onto my side, facing Matt, and gently nudged him. "Matt," I whispered, trying to wake him without making too much noise. He mumbled something and swatted at me, not really waking up. I nudged him again, harder this time. "Matt, wake up." He groaned, finally rolling onto his back, his eyes squinting open. "What?" he muttered, his voice heavy with sleep. "Listen," I said, my own voice barely above a whisper. I strained my ears, trying to hear anything beyond the thin fabric of our tent. The silence was unnatural. Usually, even late at night, there'd be some noise, wind in the trees, the distant call of an owl, something, but it was just still, too still. Matt blinked, frowning. He sat up slightly, looking around the dark interior of the tent. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice lower now, his grogginess fading as he picked up on my unease. "I don't know," I said. "Just something doesn't feel right." We both sat there for a moment, listening. Then, just when I thought maybe I was imagining it, we heard it. A sound, soft, almost like a shuffle, coming from somewhere just beyond the tent. My stomach clenched, and I saw Matt's eyes widen, his body going still. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I shook my head, my heart beginning to pound in my chest. I slowly reached for the flashlight next to my sleeping bag, my fingers trembling as I gripped it. Matt was staring at the tent flap, his face pale in the darkness. I clicked the flashlight on, the beam casting a small, shaky circle of light inside the tent. I nodded at Matt, and he gave me a look, part fear, part resolve, and started to unzip the tent flap, just enough for me to poke my head out. The cold night air rushed in, and I shivered, squinting into the darkness outside. I pointed the flashlight out, the beam cutting across our small campsite. Nothing. Just the fire pit, the dying embers glowing faintly, the dark shapes of trees looming all around us. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and listened, my ears strained for any sound, any hint that something or someone was out there. Then I heard it again, a soft rustling, like something moving through the underbrush, just beyond the light. I swung the flashlight in the direction of the noise, my hand shaking. The beam flickered for a moment, and I tapped it against my palm, my breath caught in my throat. The light steadied, and I saw it, movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. I pulled back into the tent, my heart pounding. "There's something out there," I whispered, my voice shaking. Matt's eyes went wide, and he grabbed the hatchet we had brought for firewood, his knuckles white as he gripped it. "What do you mean, something?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't know," I said, shaking my head. I saw something moving. It was tall, like really tall." Matt stared at me for a moment, then took a deep breath, nodding. "All right," he said, his voice steadier now. "We need to get out of here. Get to the car." I nodded, my stomach churning. The car was parked a good half-mile from the campsite, down a narrow trail that cut through the trees. The thought of walking that trail, with whatever was out there, made my skin crawl. But staying here felt worse, like we were sitting ducks, waiting for whatever it was to come back. We moved quickly, packing up what we could, not bothering with the tent. I shoved my flashlight into my pocket, keeping it turned on, the beam pointing out from the fabric as I grabbed my pack. Matt had the hatchet in one hand, his pack slung over his shoulder, his eyes darting around the campsite. "Ready?" he asked, his voice tight. I nodded, and we stepped out of the tent, the cold air biting at my face. The clearing was dark, the trees around us like a solid wall, the shadows deep and impenetrable. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow, my heart pounding in my ears. We started moving, Matt leading the way, the beam from my flashlight bouncing with each step. Every few steps, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see something moving behind us, something slipping between the trees. The forest felt alive, like it was watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. My legs felt like lead, each step an effort as we made our way down the narrow trail, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Then a sound, a snap, loud, like a branch breaking underfoot. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Matt stopped too, his head whipping around, his eyes wide. The sound had come from behind us, from the direction of the campsite. I turned, my flashlight beam flicking through the trees, searching for the source of the noise. There it was, a figure, tall, standing just at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the shadows. My heart felt like it stopped. The thing was just standing there, watching us. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, its shoulders broad, its body covered in something dark, maybe fur. I couldn't see its face, just the outline of its head, the way it seemed to blend into the darkness around it. "Matt," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "we need to go. Now." He didn't need me to say it twice. He turned, and we started moving again, faster this time, almost running. My flashlight bobbed wildly, the beam flickering as we stumbled over roots and rocks, the trail uneven beneath our feet. I could hear Matt's breathing, harsh and ragged, matching my own, and behind us, I heard it, the sound of heavy footsteps, slow but deliberate, following us. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I focused on the trail ahead, the narrow strip of dirt that seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness around us thick, pressing in from all sides. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I pushed on, my mind blank except for the need to get away, to get to the car, to get out. The footsteps behind us grew louder, closer, and I felt a surge of panic, my hands trembling as I gripped the flashlight. I could see the car now, just up ahead, the shape of it barely visible in the darkness. "Matt, the car!" I shouted, my voice cracking. We reached it, practically slamming into the side as we skidded to a stop. Matt fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, cursing under his breath as he tried to unlock the door. I turned, my back against the car, the flashlight beam pointed towards the trail. The footsteps had stopped, the clearing was empty, but I knew it was there somewhere, just beyond the edge of the light. The car door finally clicked open, and we scrambled inside, slamming the doors shut, the sound echoing in the stillness. Matt jammed the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life, and I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made me dizzy. He threw the car into gear, the tires spinning on the loose dirt before catching, the car lurching forward. I looked out the window, my eyes scanning the tree line as we sped away. And then I saw it, just for a second, a glimpse of that tall figure standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us leave. My stomach twisted, a chill running down my spine, and I turned away, my hands clenched in my lap, my breath coming in short, shaky gasps. We didn't stop driving until we reached the main road, the lights of the highway like a beacon cutting through the darkness. Matt pulled over, his hands still gripping the wheel, his knuckles white. He looked at me, his face pale, his eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice cracking. I shook my head, unable to answer. I didn't know. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that we were safe, that we had gotten away. I leaned back in the seat, closing my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, my heart still pounding in my chest. We sat there for a long time, neither of us speaking, the only sound the low hum of the engine. Finally, Matt let out a shaky breath, his hands relaxing on the wheel. He looked at me, his eyes meeting mine. "We're not going back there," he said, his voice firm. I nodded, swallowing hard. "No," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "We're not." And that was it. We turned back onto the highway, the lights of the car cutting through the darkness, and drove away, leaving the forest behind us. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Whatever was out there, it could stay there. We weren't coming back. Not ever. Story 12. It was just another late-night drive on a deserted road, a road I'd driven dozens of times before. But that night, something stepped out in front of me, and I swear it wasn't anything I've ever seen before. It only took a few seconds, but those seconds felt like a lifetime. My name's Marcus, and that night I was coming back from visiting my brother. He lives a few towns over, and to get there, you have to take this old, winding road through the forest. It's one of those roads that feels endless when you're driving it alone at night. Just darkness pressing in on all sides, only the headlights cutting through it, the occasional flicker of an animal's eyes catching the light before disappearing back into the woods. I had the windows cracked just a bit, enough to let in some fresh air. The car's radio was on, barely loud enough to hear. I was tired, but not the kind of tired that makes you lose focus, just the kind of tired that makes you want to get home, to be done with the drive. The clock on the dashboard said it was close to midnight, and I knew I had maybe 20 more minutes to go before I'd be home. The road was empty. I hadn't seen another car in ages, just me, the endless stretch of asphalt, and the tall silhouettes of trees on either side. I was cruising along, keeping a steady speed, the hum of the engine the only real sound. Everything was normal until it wasn't. Out of nowhere, something moved into the headlights. I slammed my foot on the brake, hard. My heart jumped into my throat as the tires squealed, the car lurching forward, the seatbelt cutting into my shoulder. The headlights lit up this figure, a massive, upright figure. For a split second, I thought it was a person, but then I realized it was too big, too bulky, covered in dark, matted hair. It crossed the road in 2 long strides, and then it was gone, disappearing into the darkness on the other side. I sat there, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white, my foot still pressing the brake. The car was dead still, except for the slight rocking from the sudden stop. My pulse was pounding in my ears, my mouth completely dry. I blinked, staring at the empty road ahead, my headlights stretching into the dark. My brain struggled to catch up with what I'd just seen. It couldn't have been a bear. Bears don't move like that. It wasn't a person either. It moved too fast, too fluid. It was upright, tall, and it was gone before I even had time to really process it. I sat there for what felt like forever, my eyes darting from one side of the road to the other, trying to see into the thick forest, trying to catch any more movement. There was nothing, just the stillness of the trees, the darkness that seemed even heavier now. My breathing was shallow, and I could feel sweat beading on my forehead, my whole body tense, like I was waiting for something to happen, for it to come back. I finally forced myself to move, to ease my foot off the brake, my hands shaky as I shifted back into drive. The car crept forward, the headlights sweeping over the empty stretch of road. My eyes kept flicking to the trees on either side, half expecting to see that shape again, watching from the shadows. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just an animal, maybe my tired mind playing tricks on me, but I knew that wasn't true. I knew what I saw. It was real, and it was something that shouldn't have been there. As I drove, I kept my speed low, my eyes scanning the road, my hands still gripping the wheel tight. I felt exposed, like whatever that thing was, it could come back at any second, could step out into the road again, closer this time. The forest around me seemed to close in, the darkness heavier, the silence almost oppressive. When I finally saw the lights of the town ahead, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My shoulders relaxed a bit, my grip on the wheel loosening. I drove straight home, not even bothering to turn the radio back up, my mind replaying those few seconds over and over again, trying to make sense of it. I pulled into my driveway, turned off the car, and just sat there for a moment, staring at the darkened street outside. My heart was still racing, my mind still buzzing. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep, not with the image of that thing burned into my brain. I got out, locked the car, and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I went to the kitchen, grabbed a glass of water, my hands still trembling. I leaned against the counter, the cool glass pressed against my lips, my eyes staring blankly at the floor. I tried to replay it again, tried to remember every detail, the height, the way it moved, the flash of those eyes in the headlights. I don't know what it was, and maybe I don't want to know. All I know is that I'm not taking that road at night anymore. Whatever I saw out there, it was real, and it was something that didn't belong on that road, something that didn't belong anywhere near where people live. I don't think I'll ever forget it, that shape, crossing in front of my car, then disappearing, like it was never really there. But I know it was, and that's what scares me the most. Story 13. I was out early, way before the sun even started thinking about rising. I liked hiking before dawn. The trails were empty, and there was something calming about having the forest to myself. The air was cold, crisp, and my breath hung in front of me in small puffs. I had my flashlight, but most of the time I didn't need it. My feet knew the path, the familiar twists and turns, the little dips where roots pushed up through the dirt. That morning felt different, though. I don't know why, but as soon as I set out, there was a heaviness in the air, the kind that made me pull my jacket a little tighter around myself, even though I wasn't really cold. The woods were quieter than usual. Normally, I'd hear some rustling in the underbrush, or the hoot of an owl, but it was dead still. It put me on edge, but I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. I kept moving, my boots crunching softly over the leaves and twigs. I was about halfway along the trail when I saw it, a silhouette, dark against the grey light of the early morning, up on the ridge to my right. I stopped, squinting, trying to make out what it was. It looked like a person, standing there still, just watching. My first thought was that it was another hiker, maybe someone who'd gotten lost or turned around, but something about the way it stood, the shape, it wasn't right. Too tall, too bulky. My stomach tightened. I kept my flashlight pointed down, just enough to see where I was stepping, and tried to move quietly. I didn't want to draw attention to myself if it was some weirdo out here. My heart picked up a bit, the beat thudding in my ears as I kept my eyes on the ridge. The figure didn't move, but it felt like it was following me, its eyes boring into my back. I picked up the pace, not running but walking faster, my breaths coming a little quicker. The trail curved, and I lost sight of the ridge for a moment, the trees closing in around me. I glanced back, my flashlight catching on the trunks, the beam flickering a bit before it steadied. Nothing, just shadows and branches. I let out a shaky breath, trying to tell myself I was just seeing things, that it was probably nothing. maybe even a trick of the light. But then, up ahead, I caught it again. Movement, a dark shape slipping between the trees. My gut twisted, and I stopped dead, my mouth going dry. It wasn't an animal. It moved too smoothly, too deliberately. It was following the trail just ahead, always staying just far enough out of reach. I turned off the flashlight, my hand trembling as I pressed the button. The dark swallowed me up, and I stood there, barely breathing, listening. I could hear something, branches creaking, leaves rustling, like something was moving slowly, carefully. I swallowed, trying to wet my throat, my ears straining for any hint of where it was. Suddenly, a loud crack, a branch snapping underfoot, echoed through the stillness, and I flinched. It was close, too close. My pulse raced, and I spun around, my eyes trying to pierce through the darkness. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there, somewhere in the shadows, watching. I needed to move. Standing there, out in the open, made me feel exposed, vulnerable. I took a step backward, my foot barely making a sound on the soft earth. Then another. The trail behind me led back the way I'd come, towards the parking lot. I just needed to get there, get to my car and leave. I took a deep breath and turned, keeping my head down, trying to move as quietly as I could. Each step felt like it took forever, my ears straining for any noise behind me. The forest seemed to press in around me, the darkness thicker now, the path barely visible in front of me. I stumbled, catching myself on a tree, my fingers digging into the rough bark. I paused, listening, my breath catching in my throat. Another noise, this one softer, almost like a sigh, carried on the wind. I turned my head, my eyes wide, trying to see. There, between the trees, a shape, tall, broad, moving slowly towards me. My chest tightened, a wave of cold fear washing over me. It wasn't rushing, it wasn't charging, it was just following, like it had all the time in the world. Panic gripped me, and I bolted. My feet pounded the trail, the flashlight bouncing in my hand, the beam flickering wildly with each step. I didn't care about being quiet anymore, didn't care if it heard me. I just needed to get away, to get out. The cold air stung my face, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I ran, the trees blurring on either side of me, the trail twisted, and I almost lost my footing, skidding on the loose dirt. I could hear something behind me, a heavy, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps. My heart pounded, my legs aching, but I forced myself to keep going, the flashlight flickering, the darkness closing in. Finally, I saw it. The break in the trees, the parking lot just ahead. Relief surged through me, and I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my vision blurring at the edges. I burst out of the woods, the gravel crunching under my boots as I ran towards my car, fumbling with the keys. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped them, my fingers clumsy as I tried to get the key into the lock. I glanced back, the flashlight beam swinging wildly across the tree line. For a split second I saw it, a figure, tall and dark, standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. My heart leapt into my throat, and I turned back, finally managing to get the door open. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut, the locks clicking into place. I sat there, my breath coming in gasps, my hands still trembling as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I didn't waste a second. I put the car in gear and hit the gas, the tires skidding on the gravel before catching, the car lurching forward. I sped away, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, the tree line blurred, the dark figure already fading from view, swallowed up by the forest. My hands were tight on the wheel, my knuckles white, my heart still racing in my chest. I didn't slow down until I was miles away, the woods far behind me, the road stretching out empty in front of me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, my body aching, my mind reeling from what I had seen. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't care. All I knew was that I was out, I was safe, and I wasn't going back. Not ever. Story 14. It was just supposed to be another fun camping trip. Just me, Jackson, and Tom out in the mountains, getting away from everything. But then something came in the night, and it wasn't any animal we'd ever heard of. We had picked a spot up in the Rockies, a place we'd been to a few times before. It was remote, but not too far from a main trail, and there was a clearing there that we always used. We got there early in the day, set up our tent, got the fire going. It was all the usual stuff, joking around, unpacking our gear, cracking open a few beers. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. Everything felt normal, even great. By the time it got dark, we had the fire roaring, and Tom was busy grilling some sausages while Jackson and I sat back, just enjoying the night. It was quiet, the kind of quiet you come out there for. No traffic, no noise, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the woods. After a while, the fire started to die down, and we figured it was time to hit the tent. We put out the fire, packed away the food, and crawled inside the tent, each of us in our sleeping bags. I don't know how long I'd been asleep before I woke up. It was sudden, one of those times when you just snap awake. No dreams, no reason. I laid there for a moment, blinking, trying to figure out what had woken me. That's when I heard it, a noise right outside the tent. It wasn't just the wind or some small animal. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing up. I could hear it, the crunch of the ground under something big, the way the steps seemed to circle the tent, each one slow, almost careful. I turned my head towards Jackson and Tom, trying to see if they were awake. In the faint light filtering in from outside, I saw Jackson's eyes open wide, staring at me. I didn't say anything, just raised my finger to my lips. He nodded, his face pale. I could tell he was hearing it too. The footsteps moved again, closer now. The kind of heavy sound that told me it was something big, much bigger than any deer. My stomach knotted up, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. Tom was still, his sleeping bag pulled up to his chin, eyes squeezed shut like he was trying to will himself to disappear. We laid there, none of us daring to breathe too loudly, just listening. The thing outside moved slowly, almost circling the tent. I could hear its breathing now, low, deep, not like any animal I'd heard before. It was heavy, almost like a snorting sound, and I could see the faint shadow of something moving past the tent, blocking out the moonlight for a split second. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat loud in my ears. I was trying to think, trying to figure out what we should do. Run? Stay quiet. My hand was gripping the zipper of my sleeping bag, my fingers shaking. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out, to move, to do something. But I didn't want to make a sound, didn't want to draw attention. The footsteps stopped right at the side of the tent. I could see the shape of it now. Something tall, something that seemed to loom over us. It just stood there, and for a second, I thought I heard it sniffing like it was trying to catch our scent. My throat was dry, my breath shallow, barely daring to let the air out in case it heard. Then, without warning, the thing moved again, this time around the back of the tent. I could hear the branches snapping as it walked, the ground crunching under its weight. It felt like forever before the sounds began to fade, each step a little further away, until finally there was nothing but silence. I let out a shaky breath, my whole body trembling. I turned my head, meeting Jackson's eyes. He looked terrified, his skin pale, his eyes wide. Tom finally opened his eyes, blinking, his face still tight with fear. None of us spoke. We just laid there, waiting, listening, trying to hear if it would come back. Minutes passed, maybe more, I don't know. It felt like time had stopped. Eventually, Jackson whispered, barely loud enough for us to hear. "What the hell was that?" His voice cracked, and I could hear the fear in it. I shook my head. "I don't know," I whispered back. "It's gone, though." Tom swallowed hard, pushing himself up a little. Are we safe?" he asked, his voice shaky. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know if we were safe or if that thing was going to come back. I just knew I wasn't going to be able to sleep again. Not after that. We sat there, the three of us, in the dark, each of us listening for any sound, any hint that it might return. Hours went by, and eventually the sky outside began to lighten, the first hints of dawn coming through the trees. We didn't wait. As soon as there was enough light, we got out of that tent, packed up as fast as we could. None of us spoke much. There wasn't anything to say. We all felt it, that unease, the sense that we weren't alone out there. We got back to the car, threw our gear in, and left. The drive back was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts, the tension still there, hanging heavy in the air. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something on the trail behind us, something tall and dark moving between the trees. We haven't been back to that spot since. We've talked about it a few times, tried to figure out what it could have been. A bear, maybe. But bears don't act like that. They don't circle your tent, don't breathe like that, don't move like they know you're in there, watching, waiting. Whatever it wasn't just curious. It knew we were there and it wanted us to know it too. Even now, I can still hear those footsteps sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet. That slow, deliberate crunch, the breathing, the sense of something big, something that shouldn't be there. It's a sound I don't think I'll ever forget. Story 15. The first night we heard the screams, we all froze. It was me, Cassie, Eric, and Jenna, sitting around the fire, roasting marshmallows, trading stories. The sky was clear, the stars were bright, and we were deep in the Rockies, miles away from anything. It was supposed to be a perfect weekend. No phones, no work, no stress, but that sound cut through everything like a knife. It started as a low wail, then turned into something high-pitched, almost like a woman screaming. It echoed from somewhere far off in the woods, bouncing between the trees, fading, then rising again. The fire crackled, and we all just sat there staring at each other, the marshmallows forgotten, the laughter gone. My skin prickled, a cold shiver running down my spine. "What the hell was that?" Cassie whispered, her voice barely audible. Eric shook his head, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. "Probably a coyote," he said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. I wasn't so sure. I'd heard coyotes before, and this didn't sound like a coyote. It sounded too human, too desperate. My chest tightened, a weird mix of fear and curiosity gnawing at me. Jenna pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, her eyes wide. "It sounded close," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't say anything, just nodded. "Close, yeah, but also strange, like it was coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once." Eric stood up, tossing his marshmallow stick into the fire. "I'll go check it out. Probably just some animal caught in something," he said, forcing a grin. I could tell he was trying to make us feel better, trying to act like everything was fine. But his eyes were tense, the muscles in his jaw tight. I stood up, grabbing the flashlight. "I'll come with you," I said, not really wanting to let him go alone. The thought of staying behind by the fire wasn't much better. At least if I was moving, I wouldn't be sitting here waiting for that scream to come again. Cassie looked at me like I was crazy. "Are you sure? What if it's, what if it's something dangerous?" I forced a smile, trying to steady my voice. "We'll be fine. We'll just take a quick look." I clicked on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness beyond the campfire, the light shaky from the trembling in my hands. Eric gave me a nod, and we moved away from the fire, into the woods, the light flickering over the ground. The further we moved from the campsite, the colder the air got, the darkness closing in around us. The trees stood like silent shadows, the branches reaching over our heads, blocking out the sky. The beam of the flashlight seemed weak, swallowed by the darkness. My heart was pounding, each step feeling like a mistake, but I kept moving, Eric beside me, the crunch of our boots loud in the stillness. We stopped, listening. The forest was dead quiet. No wind, no rustling of leaves, just the sound of our own breathing. I swallowed, my throat dry, and turned the flashlight in a slow circle. Nothing, just trees, shadows, and more darkness. I was about to say we should head back when I heard it again. A scream. Closer this time. My stomach dropped, and I swung the flashlight towards the sound, my hand shaking so bad the beam jittered over the trees. The scream faded into a low wail, like something in pain, then stopped abruptly. The silence came rushing back, thicker now, like it was pressing down on us. "What the hell is that?" Eric muttered, his voice low, almost drowned out by the pounding in my ears. He looked at me, his face pale in the dim light, and I could see the fear there, the uncertainty. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. My whole body felt tense, every muscle tight, waiting, ready for something to happen. I took a step forward, the light flickering over the trees, my ears straining for any sound. Nothing moved. I felt like we were being watched, like there were eyes on us from somewhere in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the light. "We should go back," Eric said, his voice shaking now. This doesn't feel right." I nodded, my heart hammering, and we turned, moving quickly back towards the campsite. My pulse was racing, and every few steps I'd glance over my shoulder, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly, half expecting to see something following us. The forest felt alive, like it was holding its breath, waiting for us to slip up. We stumbled back into the clearing, the fire still crackling, Jenna and Cassie looking up at us, their faces tense, eyes wide. Jenna stood up, her voice tight with fear. "Did you see anything?" I shook my head, trying to catch my breath. "No, just more woods." I didn't mention the scream, didn't want to make it worse, didn't want to see the fear on their faces get any deeper, but from the look in Eric's eyes, I knew he was thinking the same thing I was. There was something out there, and it wasn't just an animal. We sat back down around the fire, the silence stretching on, heavy and oppressive. No one spoke. The flames flickered, casting long shadows around the clearing, and I kept my eyes on the edge of the light, watching for any movement. My hands were still shaking, the adrenaline making my whole body feel wired, tense. Another scream cut through the air, closer now, and I saw Jenna jump, her eyes wide with fear. Cassie grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't have an answer. The scream faded into a low moan, then stopped, leaving the forest silent again. My stomach twisted, fear gnawing at me, and I forced myself to stand up. "We need to leave," I said, my voice steady, even though I didn't feel steady. "Now, we can't stay here." Eric nodded, already grabbing his pack, his face set, eyes darting around the clearing. Jenna and Cassie moved quickly, throwing things into their bags, their movements frantic. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the air, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. We packed up fast, barely bothering to put out the fire. My heart was pounding, my ears straining for any sound, every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves making me jump. We started down the trail, moving quickly, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness, the light swinging back and forth as we hurried along. The screams came again, behind us, farther away now but still too close. I didn't look back, my legs were aching, my breath coming in short gasps, but I didn't slow down. I could hear Jenna breathing hard behind me, could feel Cassie's hand gripping the back of my jacket as we moved. Eric was in front, the light from his flashlight bobbing ahead, leading us down the trail. The darkness felt like it was closing in, the cold air biting at my face, my fingers numb where they gripped the flashlight. I just kept moving, focusing on the ground in front of me, the narrow strip of dirt that seemed to stretch on forever. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud in my ears, drowning out everything else. We finally made it to the parking lot, the cars sitting there like lifelines. Eric fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I glanced back, the flashlight swinging towards the tree line, half expecting to see something standing there, watching us. But there was nothing, just shadows and darkness. We piled into the cars, slamming the doors shut, the locks clicking into place. I sat there, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts, my hands trembling in my lap. Eric started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness, and I felt a wave of relief as we pulled out of the lot, the tires crunching on the gravel. I looked out the window, my eyes scanning the edge of the forest, the beam of the headlights sweeping over the trees. I didn't see anything, but that feeling was still there, that feeling of being watched, of something out there, just beyond the light, waiting. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, the forest far behind us, the road stretching out empty in front of us. No one spoke. The car was silent. The only sound, the hum of the engine and the pounding of my heart, slowly beginning to calm. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, trying to shake off the fear that still clung to me. I didn't know what we had heard, didn't want to think about it. All I knew was that we were out, that we were safe, and that we weren't going back. Not to that place. Not ever. Story 16. I just needed a quick break from the crowded lodge, nothing more. Just a smoke outside to clear my head. But when I stepped out that night, I realized I wasn't alone, and whatever was out there wasn't just another guest. My name is Ingrid. I was staying at this little lodge up in the mountains, taking a few days off to clear my mind, relax, and maybe do some light hiking during the day. The lodge was cozy, old wooden beams, warm fire, the kind of place where you could just sit by the window and watch the snowfall. The owner, an old guy named Carl, was friendly enough. He had warned me it could get pretty quiet up here, especially during the winter months. But that's what I wanted. Some quiet. That night, after a long day of walking the trails, I decided to have a drink by the fire. The lounge area was small, with just a few guests hanging around, chatting in low voices. After a couple of drinks, I started to feel a bit restless. Maybe the alcohol, maybe the stuffy room. I grabbed my coat and decided to step outside, light up a cigarette, and enjoy the cold air for a bit. I pushed open the lodge door, the hinges creaking slightly, and stepped out onto the small porch. The cold hit me immediately, biting at my nose and cheeks. I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck and fumbled in my pocket for my lighter. The sky was clear, the stars bright, and the pine trees around the lodge loomed tall and dark against the snow. Everything was so still, so quiet, that I could almost hear the sound of the snow settling around me. I lit my cigarette, the tip flaring orange in the darkness, and took a deep drag, letting the smoke fill my lungs. That's when I heard it. A sound off to my right, somewhere near the tree line. It was a kind of rustling, soft at first, like something moving through the underbrush. I glanced over, squinting into the dark, but couldn't see anything. Just the black shapes of the trees, their branches swaying slightly in the wind. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just some small animal, a fox or maybe even a raccoon. I took another drag, staring out into the night, but the sound came again. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. It didn't sound like a small animal. It sounded heavy, like something big moving slowly, almost cautiously. My stomach twisted, a shiver running down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I strained my ears, listening, my breath held in my chest. There it was again, a low, almost rhythmic noise, like a kind of grunting, echoing faintly through the trees. My hands started to tremble, the cigarette shaking between my fingers. I took a step back, my boots crunching on the snow-covered porch. I flicked the cigarette away, watching the ember sizzle in the snow, and turned back towards the door. I didn't want to stand out there anymore. Not with whatever was making that noise still in the dark. I reached for the doorknob, my fingers stiff from the cold, and just as I touched it, I heard another sound, a high-pitched call, almost like a whistle, but strange, like it was trying to mimic something natural and failing. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned my head. my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the lodge. At first, I couldn't see anything, just the dim outline of the trees, the shadows deep and thick between the trunks. But then I saw it. Movement. Something shifting just beyond the first line of trees. It was tall, taller than any person. A dark shape blending in with the forest, and it was swaying, almost like it was rocking back and forth. My mouth went dry, my pulse thudding in my ears. The shape was still, just watching. I could feel my skin prickling, the hair standing up on the back of my neck. I didn't know what it was, but every part of me screamed that it wasn't right, that it shouldn't be there. It took all my strength to tear my eyes away, to turn back to the door and shove it open, stumbling back inside the lodge. The door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the quiet hallway. I stood there, panting, my back pressed against the wood, my eyes wide. The warmth of the lodge hit me, but I couldn't feel it, my whole body still cold, my hands trembling. I tried to steady my breath, tried to tell myself I was just seeing things, that it was the dark playing tricks on me, but I knew what I saw. It was real, and it was watching me. I took a deep breath and pushed myself away from the door, my legs shaky. I walked back into the lounge, trying to look normal, trying to act like everything was fine. Carl, the old man who owned the place, was sitting by the fire, his eyes half closed, a glass of something dark in his hand. He looked up as I walked in, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You all right there?" he asked, his voice low and rough, like gravel. I nodded quickly, swallowing hard. "Yeah, just thought I saw something out there." Carl's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, a kind of knowing look. He leaned back in his chair, taking a slow sip from his glass. "A lot of folks say that," he said after a moment, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something about these woods makes people think they see things." I stared at him, my mouth opening, then closing again. He didn't say anything else, just turned his eyes back to the fire, his face unreadable. I wanted to ask more, to tell him what I saw, but something in his expression stopped me. It was like he already knew, like he'd heard it all before. I turned away, heading up the stairs to my room, my legs still feeling weak, my hands cold despite the warmth of the lodge. I locked the door behind me, double-checking it before I crossed the room to the window. I peeked out, my eyes scanning the tree line, the snow-covered ground dim in the moonlight. Everything looked still, quiet. No movement, no dark shapes shifting between the trees. I let out a shaky breath, stepping away from the window, my heart still racing. I knew I wouldn't sleep that night, not with that thing out there, whatever it was. I didn't turn off the light. I just sat on the edge of the bed, listening, waiting, every creak of the old lodge making me jump. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the window, I felt a weight lift off my chest, the fear easing slightly. I packed my things, my movements hurried, my eyes constantly flicking back to the window, to the door. I wanted to leave, to get out of that place, away from those woods. As I was checking out, Carl gave me a long look, his eyes searching mine. He didn't say anything, just nodded once, like he understood, like he'd seen it all before. I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't want to know the answers. I got in my car, started the engine and pulled away, the lodge growing smaller in the rearview mirror, the tall pines closing in on either side of the road. I kept my eyes on the road, my grip tight on the wheel, my heart still pounding. I knew I wouldn't come back, not to that lodge, not to those mountains. Whatever was out there, it was something that shouldn't be disturbed, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what it wanted. Story 17. I was driving home after a long day of fishing. The road through the forest was pitch black, nothing but the occasional glimmer of moonlight breaking through the trees. My truck's headlights carved out a tunnel of light ahead of me, and I kept my eyes on the road, just wanting to get home, take a shower and get some rest. It was late, probably around midnight, and the road was completely empty. No other cars, no streetlights, just me and the darkness. I was cruising at a decent speed, enjoying the cool air through the open window, when suddenly something caught my eye up ahead. I saw movement on the side of the road, just at the edge of my headlights. Reach. I squinted, my foot hovering over the brake. I thought maybe it was a deer, and I didn't want to hit anything, but as I got closer, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a deer. It was tall, upright, walking across the road on two legs. It was covered in dark, matted fur, and it moved smoothly, almost too smoothly for something that big. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, and I slammed on the brakes, the truck lurching as the tires skidded on the asphalt. The figure turned its head just for a second, and I caught a glimpse of its face, dark, with deep-set eyes that reflected the light. My heart jumped into my throat. It didn't look human, not entirely. It was something else, something bigger, its shoulders broad, its arms hanging low at its sides. It crossed the road in just a few strides, disappearing into the trees on the other side. I sat there in the middle of the road, my truck idling, my hands still clenched around the wheel. My breath was coming fast, my chest tight. I stared at the spot where it had disappeared, my headlights illuminating nothing but the trees, the shadows thick and impenetrable. The forest was silent, no rustling, no movement, nothing. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Maybe it was a bear, I told myself. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. Bears don't walk like that. They don't move like that. Whatever this was, it wasn't a bear. I realized I was still stopped in the middle of the road, and I forced myself to take a deep breath, my hands shaking as I eased off the brake. I pressed down on the gas, the truck rolling forward, the headlights cutting through the dark. I kept my eyes on the tree line, half expecting to see it again, to see those eyes staring back at me from the shadows. The road stretched on, winding through the forest, and I tried to shake off the feeling that I was being watched. My heart was still pounding, and I could feel the sweat on the back of my neck, cold and clammy. I reached over and rolled up the window, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty, just darkness swallowing up the red glow of my taillights. A few minutes later, I thought I had finally started to calm down when I saw something move again, this time in my rearview mirror. My stomach twisted, and I glanced up, my eyes widening. For just a second, I saw it again, stepping out onto the road behind me, its silhouette framed in the red glow of the taillights. It was standing there, watching me, and then it was gone, slipping back into the darkness. "Shit," I muttered, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I pressed down on the gas, the truck's engine roaring as I sped up, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the mirror. I didn't see it again, but the feeling that it was there, somewhere behind me, wouldn't go away. The road twisted and turned, and I forced myself to focus, my hands still trembling. I just needed to get out of these woods, get back to town, get somewhere with lights and people. The darkness felt like it was closing in, the trees pressing closer to the road, the shadows growing deeper. Finally, I saw the turnoff up ahead, the sign barely visible in the headlights. I took the turn too fast, the tires skidding for a moment before they caught, the truck straightening out as I headed down the road that would take me back to town. The trees started to thin, the forest giving way to open fields, and I let out a shaky breath, my shoulders slumping, the tension slowly leaving my body. I didn't stop driving until I was back in my driveway, the lights of my house glowing softly in the dark. I put the truck in park, my hands still shaking as I turned off the engine. I sat there for a moment, the silence ringing in my ears, my heart finally starting to slow. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't know if anyone would believe me if I told them, but I know one thing. I wasn't alone on that road, and whatever was out there, it was still watching. I grabbed my keys, my eyes flicking to the darkness beyond the driveway, and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't look out the windows that night. I didn't want to see if it was still there, standing at the edge of the woods, watching. I just wanted to forget, to pretend that it had never happened, but even now I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there it's still waiting. Story 18. Nate and I were looking forward to a quiet camping trip, just the two of us, a fire and the stars above. We had our little campsite set up, the grill going, and nothing but the forest around us. But that night, things took a turn we didn't expect, and I've never felt anything like it. It was late afternoon when we got to our spot, a perfect place, remote, with a small clearing just off the trail. We pitched our tent, set up the grill, and put the cooler down next to a couple of folding chairs. The sun was setting slowly, throwing long shadows over the trees, but we didn't mind. We were deep enough into the forest that the sounds of the highway had long since disappeared, leaving just the rustle of leaves and the occasional call of some unseen bird. Nate was excited about grilling. He'd been talking about it for weeks. Sausages, marshmallows, all the good camping stuff. We got the fire going and set the grill over it, cracking open a couple of beers while the coals started to glow red. It was the kind of peace that we came for. We sat there, watching the smoke twist up towards the treetops, the flames licking at the sausages. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air started to cool down. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and scooted closer to the fire. Everything was going great until this awful smell hit us out of nowhere. It was sudden, like someone had thrown a wet, rotting rag right in front of us. Nate scrunched his nose, looking over at me. I knew he could smell it too. "What is that?" he muttered, sniffing at the air, his face twisted in disgust. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was overpowering, a mix of wet dog and something dead. I looked around, shining my flashlight out into the trees, but there was nothing there, just darkness and the shifting silhouettes of leaves in the wind. "It's probably just some animal," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I didn't believe it. The smell was too strong, too sudden, like it had come out of nowhere. Nate nodded, but he looked uneasy. He turned the sausages over on the grill, but I could tell he wasn't focused anymore. He kept glancing around, his eyes flicking from the tree line back to the fire, his grip on the tongs a little too tight. I felt it too, that creeping unease. The forest, which had seemed so inviting just minutes before, now felt different, like something was out there, hidden just beyond the reach of the firelight. Then we heard it, a snap, loud and close. It came from the trees to our left, the kind of sound that makes your heart jump, like a branch breaking under something heavy. We both turned at the same time, the flashlight beam darting towards the noise. I held my breath, straining my ears, trying to hear something, anything. Another crack, this time from behind us. Nate swung his head around, his eyes wide. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the air, and I jumped, my skin prickling with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. The smell was getting stronger, almost making me gag. It felt like it was pressing in on us, like something was moving closer. "Nate," I whispered, not sure what else to say. He nodded, his eyes scanning the shadows, his face pale in the firelight. He set the tongs down, moving slowly, deliberately, like he didn't want to make a sound. "We should pack up," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I don't like this." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I got up slowly, grabbing the cooler and dragging it closer to the tent. My hands were shaking, and I fumbled with the latch, my eyes darting back to the darkness around us. Nate was putting the food back into a container, his movements stiff and hurried. The smell was almost unbearable now, thick and heavy in the air, making my eyes water. Then, just beyond the edge of the firelight, I saw something move. It was quick, a flash of something tall and dark slipping between the trees. My breath caught in my throat, and I dropped the cooler, the sound of it hitting the ground loud in the quiet night. "Nate!" I hissed, my voice trembling. He looked up, his eyes wide, following my gaze. He didn't ask what I saw. He must have seen it too, because he dropped everything, grabbed my arm, and pulled me towards the car. "Forget it. Let's go," he said, his voice tight with fear. I didn't argue. I turned, stumbling over the uneven ground as we ran towards the car. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Behind us, I heard another crack. Louder this time, like something big was moving, something that wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. We reached the car, and Nate fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped them. I glanced back towards the campsite, the fire still flickering, the shadows shifting around it. For a second, I thought I saw it again, a tall shape, just beyond the fire, standing still, watching us. My stomach twisted with fear, and I yanked on the door handle, throwing myself inside as soon as Nate got the car unlocked. He started the engine, the headlights flicking on, cutting through the darkness. For a moment, everything seemed still, the forest frozen in the harsh light. Then, just at the edge of the clearing, something moved, something tall, covered in dark, matted hair, slipping back into the shadows. "Go, go, go!" I yelled, my voice breaking, and Nate didn't hesitate. He slammed his foot on the gas, the tires spinning for a second before we lurched forward, speeding away from the clearing. I kept my eyes on the side mirror, watching as the campsite disappeared behind us, the firelight shrinking until it was just a faint glow between the trees. We didn't stop driving until we were back on the main road, the forest far behind us. Nate's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his jaw clenched tight. I leaned back in my seat, my whole body trembling, my breath finally starting to slow. Neither of us spoke. There wasn't anything to say. We both knew what we had seen, even if we didn't want to admit it. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't any animal we knew. It was something else, something that shouldn't have been there, something that had been watching us. We ended up driving all the way back home that night, not stopping until we were safe inside Nate's apartment, the door locked tight behind us. We sat there in the silence, the weight of what had happened settling over us, neither of us wanting to break it. Eventually, Nate looked over at me, his face still pale, his eyes wide. "We're not going back there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, never again, and we haven't. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something we wanted to see again. That smell, those sounds, the feeling of being watched. It's something I still think about, late at night, when everything is quiet, and I wonder if it's still out there, somewhere, waiting." Story 19. We thought it was just going to be a quiet morning of birdwatching. A simple hike, binoculars in hand, scanning the treetops. But we found something else out there, something that none of us were prepared for, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. My name is Oliver, and I was leading a small group of birdwatching enthusiasts through a remote area of the forest. There were 5 of us in total, all carrying gear, binoculars, cameras, notepads for jotting down sightings. The day was just starting, the sun barely breaking through the dense canopy above us, and we were excited. It was the kind of morning that felt perfect. Cool air, fresh smells of pine, a soft rustle of wind in the branches. Everything felt right. We had just rounded a bend in the trail when one of the group members, Sarah, stopped dead in her tracks. I nearly bumped into her, and I remember feeling that flash of irritation before I realized she was pointing at something on the ground. "Look at these," she said, her voice tight, her finger aimed at the dirt. I stepped around her, peering down, and my stomach did a little flip. Footprints, huge ones. They were deep, pressed into the mud, each print at least twice the size of my own boot. The shape of them was wrong, not quite human but not an animal either. Wide, with a distinct arch and what looked like 5 toes. I knelt down, my heart starting to beat a little faster as I traced the outline with my eyes. "Those aren't bear tracks," I said, more to myself than to anyone else. I could hear the others murmuring behind me, shifting nervously on their feet. I could feel the air change. What had been a peaceful morning suddenly felt tense. off. Sarah looked at me, her eyes wide. "What do you think made them?" she asked. I didn't answer. I didn't know. The prints were spaced out like something large had been walking through, each step wide and deliberate, leading off the trail and into the thicker brush. I stood up, my eyes following the tracks as they disappeared into the trees. The rest of the group was quiet now, the cheerful conversation from earlier completely gone. We all stared at those prints, and I could feel it. A sense of unease, that crawling feeling on the back of your neck when you know something isn't right. I took a deep breath, trying to shake it off. "Let's keep moving," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We'll stay on the trail." The group nodded, but I could see the hesitation in their eyes. We started walking again, but the mood had shifted. Nobody was talking now, our footsteps quieter, each of us glancing at the sides of the trail, at the shadows that seemed deeper now, more menacing. I could feel my heart thudding in my chest, my eyes darting from tree to tree, looking for any movement. We kept on for maybe another 15 minutes, but it felt longer. The forest, which had seemed so alive earlier, now felt empty, like everything had gone quiet, waiting. Then, just as we came to a small clearing, we heard it. A sound that made me stop in my tracks, my skin going cold. A crack, loud and sharp, like a branch snapping under pressure. It came from somewhere to our left, deeper in the woods, and I turned my head, straining my ears, my breath caught in my throat. There was a second crack, then silence. The kind of silence that makes your stomach twist because you know there shouldn't be silence. Not out here. "Did you hear that?" someone whispered behind me. Maybe James, one of the other group members. His voice shook, and I knew he was scared. I was too. I nodded slowly, not taking my eyes off the tree line. "Yeah, let's just keep moving, okay? Stay together." I tried to sound confident, but my voice came out thin, uncertain. We started moving again, faster now, our footsteps almost in sync, crunching on the dry leaves. I could feel the tension, the fear radiating from everyone around me. I kept my eyes ahead, focusing on the trail, but every instinct I had was telling me to look behind, to check if something was following us. We had almost made it past the clearing when we heard it again. This time, it wasn't a crack. It was a noise, a deep guttural sound, almost like a groan, but more animalistic, more primal. It echoed through the trees, and I felt my heart drop into my stomach. My hands were shaking, and I swallowed hard, trying to fight the panic rising in my chest. Sarah gasped, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. I looked over at her, her eyes wide, her face pale. The others had stopped, all of us frozen, listening. The sound came again, this time closer, that deep rumbling that felt like it was vibrating in my bones. "Go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Go, now." We moved, faster this time, almost jogging down the trail. The gear we carried bounced against our sides, the binoculars clattering. My breathing was fast, shallow, and I could hear the others panting too, our steps stumbling over roots and rocks. The trail twisted and turned, and I could feel the trees pressing in on us, the shadows growing deeper as the sun climbed higher in the sky. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see whatever was making that sound. I could feel the hair standing up on the back of my neck, every instinct screaming at me to get out, to keep moving. The trail seemed longer than I remembered, the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. Finally, I saw it, the break in the trees that led back to the parking area. My chest tightened with relief, and I pushed forward, almost running now, the rest of the group right behind me. We burst out of the forest, into the clearing where our cars were parked, and I felt like I could breathe again, my shoulders relaxing just a little. We didn't stop. We headed straight for the cars, throwing our gear into the back, slamming the doors shut behind us. I climbed into the driver's seat, my hands still shaking as I fumbled with the keys, finally getting the engine to start. I glanced in the rearview mirror, the tree line looming at the edge of the parking lot, half expecting to see something step out, something dark and tall, but there was nothing. I let out a shaky breath, my heart still pounding as I pulled out of the lot, the tires crunching on the gravel. The others followed, our cars in a line as we drove away from the forest, the silence heavy in the car. I could see Sarah in the passenger seat, her hands clenched in her lap, her eyes staring straight ahead. None of us spoke. There wasn't anything to say. We all knew what we'd seen, what we'd heard, those tracks, the noises. It wasn't something that should have been there. It was something different, something that made the forest feel wrong, dangerous. I don't think I'll ever forget the sound of those footsteps, the way the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I haven't gone back there since, and I don't plan to. There's something in those woods, something that watches, that follows, and I don't want to be there when it decides to come closer. Story 20. It was supposed to be just a quick evening walk. The kind of thing I did all the time to clear my head, a way to get some fresh air before it got too dark. But I ended up out there alone, with something following me, and I can still feel the fear in my bones every time I think about it. My name's Emily, and I've always loved exploring the woods. There's an old path nearby, a logging trail that's mostly forgotten now, overgrown in places but still visible enough to follow. It wasn't too far from my place, and I thought it'd be the perfect spot for a short hike before the sun went down. The weather was decent, cool with a bit of a breeze, and the forest had that late evening hush to it, not silent, but calmer, like the day was starting to wind down. I started out around 6 with enough light still left in the sky. The trail cut through a section of dense pines, the kind that grow so close together that they almost block out the sun entirely. The ground was soft with needles, and my footsteps were muffled, the only sound the occasional crunch when I stepped on a fallen branch. The air was fresh, and I could hear birds somewhere high up in the branches. I remember feeling good, like I was right where I wanted to be. About halfway down the trail, the air changed. It got colder all of a sudden, like I'd stepped into the shade, but it was more than that. It was like the whole forest went quiet at once. I stopped walking, just to listen. There wasn't a breeze, no rustling leaves, and even the birds had gone silent. My stomach twisted a bit, a prickle running down my back, but I shrugged it off. I figured it was just my imagination. I kept moving, a little faster now. The light was fading quicker than I thought, and I wanted to reach the end of the trail before it got too dark. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, but everything seemed normal. The trees, the shadows, they all looked the same as they had a few minutes before. I shook my head, telling myself to stop being paranoid. Then I heard something, a rustle, coming from somewhere behind me. I stopped dead, my ears straining, trying to pick it up again. It had been faint, but enough to make me freeze. My heart started beating a little faster, and I turned slowly, squinting into the growing shadows. Nothing, just trees, and the darkness creeping in between them. I took a deep breath, my shoulders relaxing a bit, probably just an animal, a rabbit or a squirrel. I turned back and started walking again, a little more aware of the fading light, my pace quickening. A few minutes later, I heard it again. Another rustle, this time closer, almost like something stepping carefully through the brush. I spun around, my eyes wide, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My flashlight was still in my backpack, and I fumbled to get it, my fingers shaking a little as I pulled it out. I clicked it on. The beam slicing through the dim light, bouncing over the trunks and undergrowth. Again, nothing, no movement, no sound, just stillness, the kind that made my chest tighten, made my breath catch in my throat. I kept the flashlight on, moving it slowly from side to side, my ears straining for any hint of noise. I could feel my pulse in my temples now, a steady thump that matched the growing unease in my gut. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and shaky. No answer, just the soft echo of my own voice coming back at me. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the way my hands felt clammy, the way every instinct I had was telling me to leave, to get out of there. I turned and started walking again, faster this time. I could feel my heart pounding, my breaths coming quicker, and I tried to focus on the trail ahead, on getting out of that section of the forest. But every few steps, I'd hear it again, something moving, just out of sight, always just behind me. I glanced back, and for a second I thought I saw it. Something tall, dark, a shadow moving between the trees. My chest went tight, and I felt the cold rush of fear hit me, spreading through my body like ice. I didn't wait to see if it was real or if it was just my imagination. I started running, my flashlight beam bobbing up and down, barely enough to light the trail in front of me. My boots pounded on the ground, my breaths coming in sharp gasps. The underbrush seemed thicker now, branches catching at my jacket, the shadows closing in. The rustling behind me kept pace, the sound louder now, like whatever was back there wasn't trying to stay hidden anymore. It was following me. I could see the end of the trail ahead, where the trees opened up into a small clearing. I pushed harder, my legs aching, my throat burning from the cold air. I burst into the clearing, stumbling over a root, almost falling before I caught myself. I spun around, the flashlight beam swinging wildly, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever had been following me. The forest was silent again. The shadows still, the trail behind me empty. I stood there, panting, my chest heaving, my hands shaking so badly the light jittered across the ground. There was nothing there, no movement, no sound, just the darkness, and the feeling of something watching from just beyond the edge of the clearing. I didn't stay to find out if it would come closer. I backed away, my eyes on the trail, the light darting from tree to tree, searching for any hint of movement. When I turned and started walking again, I kept the flashlight pointed at the woods behind me, my steps quick and uneven, my heart still pounding. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I yanked the door open, throwing myself inside, locking the doors without even thinking. I sat there for a moment, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my fingers still clenched around the flashlight. I looked back towards the trail, half expecting to see something step out of the woods, but there was nothing. Just the dark shape of the forest, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I started the engine, the roar of it breaking the silence, and pulled away, my hands still trembling as I gripped the wheel. I didn't look back again, not until I was far enough down the road that the forest was nothing more than a dark blur in the rearview mirror. My heart was still racing, the fear sitting heavy in my chest, a weight I couldn't shake. I don't know what was out there that night, and maybe I never will, but I know what I felt. I know I wasn't alone, that something was there, something that didn't want me to be there. I've stayed away from that trail since then, and I don't think I'll ever go back. There's something in those woods, something that watches, and I never want to feel that kind of fear again. Story 21. I was just about done for the day. It had been a long afternoon of routine work out in the woods, near our remote research station in the Yukon. We were setting up some new sensors. Nothing special, just checking wildlife activity. I was alone at this particular point, which wasn't unusual. My colleague Greg had moved to a different spot to work on another set of equipment. We both liked the quiet of working alone, usually. The forest around me was dense, and the light was already starting to fade. It happens fast up here, where twilight doesn't last long, and you're plunged into darkness before you even realize it. I had one last sensor to check. I was kneeling on the damp ground, fiddling with some wires, when I heard it. A sound, like something moving just beyond my line of sight, branches creaking, leaves rustling. I paused, listening, my eyes scanning the trees in front of me. The sound stopped, and I couldn't see anything, just trees and shadows. I shook it off, figuring it was probably just an animal, a deer or maybe a squirrel, something small moving around. I went back to the sensor, my fingers feeling clumsy as I tried to focus on the task at hand. But the feeling stayed, this prickling at the back of my neck, like I wasn't alone. Then I heard it again, louder this time, from my left. A cracking noise, like a branch snapping underfoot. My head jerked in that direction, my heart starting to pound a little faster. I couldn't see anything, just the thick line of pines, the shadows growing longer as the light faded. My gut was telling me something was off. It wasn't just an animal. It was too deliberate, too slow. I stood up, brushing the dirt off my knees, and grabbed my radio from my belt. "Greg, you hear anything weird out here?" I asked, my voice low, trying to keep it steady. The radio crackled, and for a second there was nothing but static, and then Greg's voice came through, faint but clear. "No, man! Why? What's up?" He sounded casual, unconcerned. Maybe it was just me being jumpy, but I couldn't shake the feeling. "Thought I heard something?" I said, glancing around, my eyes narrowing as I tried to peer into the gathering dark. "Might be nothing." "Well, let me know if you need a hand," Greg replied, and then the radio went silent again. I sighed, tucking it back onto my belt, and decided to finish up fast. I didn't want to be out here alone in the dark, not with whatever was making those noises lurking around. I knelt back down, trying to keep my attention on the sensor, my hands moving quicker now, my ears straining to pick up any sound beyond the occasional rustle of leaves. Then there it was again, a heavy, deliberate crack. Closer now, somewhere just beyond the first row of trees, maybe 20-30 feet away. My body went rigid, and I slowly stood back up, my heart thudding hard against my ribs. I turned in a slow circle, my eyes scanning the edge of the clearing, but everything was still, too still. The usual forest noise was gone, no wind, no birds, nothing. I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine, and I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. My eyes caught on something then, movement, just a flicker, at the edge of my vision. I turned my head, my pulse spiking, and for a second I saw it. A tall, dark figure standing between the trees. It was almost hidden, its outline blending in with the shadows, but it was there. My stomach dropped, and I felt a surge of cold fear. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. I couldn't see its face, couldn't make out any details, but I knew it wasn't an animal. It was too tall, too upright, its shoulders broad, its stance almost human, but wrong somehow. I fumbled for the radio again, my hands trembling as I pulled it free. "Greg," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. There's something out here." My mouth was dry, my voice sounding shaky even to my own ears. There was a long pause, and then Greg's voice crackled back. "What do you mean something, like an animal?" "No," I said, my eyes locked on that dark shape, still standing there, still watching. "It's not an animal. It's—" I didn't finish the sentence. The figure moved, just a step, but enough that I knew it was coming closer. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed up, my foot catching on a root, nearly making me stumble. Just get over here," I said into the radio, my voice shaking. "Now." I didn't wait for his response. I turned and started moving, fast, my eyes darting back and forth, trying to keep the figure in my sight. I couldn't see it anymore, but I could hear it. Soft, deliberate footsteps, crunching over the underbrush, following me. I kept moving, my breath coming faster now, my chest tight. I didn't want to run, didn't want to make noise, but every instinct was screaming at me to get out, to get away. The light was fading fast, and the shadows were getting deeper, the forest growing darker by the second. I could barely see the trail in front of me, just a faint line cutting through the trees, and I stumbled, my foot slipping on the uneven ground. My heart was pounding, and I could hear the footsteps behind me, closer now, steady, like whatever was following me knew I wasn't going to get away. I reached the edge of the clearing where we had parked our ATV, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Greg was already there, his headlamp cutting a beam of light through the dark. He looked up, his eyes widening when he saw me, saw the look on my face. "Where is it?" he asked, his voice urgent. I turned, pointing back towards the woods, my hands shaking. It was right there. It was following me. I could barely get the words out, my whole body trembling, adrenaline making my hands feel weak. Greg stared at me for a second, then nodded, turning his headlamp towards the forest. The light swept over the trees, the shadows shifting, but there was nothing there. Just darkness, the thick trunks of the pines, and the empty woods. My chest was tight, my breath still coming fast, and I swallowed hard, trying to calm down, trying to think straight. Greg looked back at me, his face pale in the light from his headlamp. "You sure you saw something?" I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. I knew what I had seen. I wasn't imagining it. There was something out there, something that had been following me, watching me. I could still feel it, the sense of being watched, the eyes on me, even though I couldn't see anything now. "We need to go," I finally managed to say, my voice cracking. "We need to get out of here." Greg didn't argue. He climbed onto the ATV, and I got on behind him, my hands still trembling as I gripped the back of the seat. He started the engine, the roar shattering the silence, and I felt a surge of relief as we started moving, the headlights cutting through the darkness, the trees blurring as we sped down the trail. I kept my eyes on the forest, watching as the shadows shifted, the light bouncing over the ground. I didn't see it again, but I knew it was there, somewhere hidden in the dark. The feeling didn't go away, even as we left the clearing behind, even as the station came into view, the lights glowing softly against the night. We pulled up to the station, and I climbed off the ATV, my legs shaky, my body feeling weak. Greg looked at me, his eyes still wide, his face tight with worry. "You're sure?" he asked again, his voice quiet. I nodded, my mouth still dry, my hands still trembling. "I'm sure," I said. "It was there." We didn't talk much after that. We went inside, locked the doors, and I watched as Greg double-checked the windows, making sure everything was secure. The station was small, just a few rooms, the light from the lamps casting long shadows on the walls. I sat down, trying to steady my breathing, trying to shake off the feeling that something was still watching, still out there. The night dragged on, the silence heavy, the darkness pressing in around us. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again, that dark figure standing between the trees, watching me. I kept listening, my ears straining for any sound beyond the walls of the station, waiting for the footsteps, for the creak of the floorboards, for anything. But there was nothing, just silence, thick and heavy, and the cold light of the lamps. Story 22. I knew something was wrong the minute I stepped outside that morning. The chickens were clucking like crazy, their sounds echoing around the yard in a chaotic mess. It wasn't the usual kind of noise they made when they were hungry or when they laid eggs. This was different, panicked. I pulled on my boots, rubbing the sleep out of my eyes, and stepped out into the yard, squinting against the early light. I'd set up the coop near the edge of the field, not far from the tree line. It was quiet out there, usually peaceful. But that morning, it wasn't. The air felt heavy, and I could already tell the chickens were upset about something. When I got closer, I noticed the espantajo I'd set up in the field. It looked off, like it wasn't in the right place. I frowned, staring at it. I knew I had put it in the middle of the field just yesterday, but now it was standing closer to the trees, almost as if someone had moved it. The straw arms drooped, and the hat was tilted to the side, and it all felt wrong. I kept walking, my boots crunching over the frosty grass, the sound of the chickens getting louder. Their feathers were puffed up, and they were pacing, their beady little eyes wide, like they were spooked. I opened the coop door to check on them, glancing around the yard. Nothing looked out of place, but there was a chill that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then I saw the footprints, huge, right there in the soft dirt near the edge of the field. They weren't mine, and they definitely weren't from an animal. They looked almost like human footprints, but bigger, way bigger. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, and I knelt down, running my fingers over the edge of one of the prints. The dirt was freshly pressed, like whatever had made them was just there. I stood up quickly, my eyes darting to the tree line, half expecting to see someone or something standing there, watching me. But there was nothing, just the trees, dark and still. I swallowed hard, wiping my hands on my jeans, and took a step back, my eyes scanning the field. The scarecrow swayed slightly in the breeze, the movement making my skin prickle. I didn't like it. None of it. I'd lived on this land for years, and I'd never seen anything like those prints. They were too big, too deliberate, leading right from the edge of the field to where the scarecrow was. I glanced back at the chickens. They were still agitated, pacing back and forth, making a racket. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease creeping through me. It was probably just some prank, I told myself. Maybe some teenagers messing around trying to freak me out. But even as I thought it, I didn't really believe it. There was something about those footprints, something about the way the scarecrow had moved, that felt wrong. I decided to check the scarecrow. It wasn't far, maybe 20 yards from where I stood. I started walking towards it, my boots crunching on the frozen grass, my eyes locked on the figure. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. The straw body looked slumped, almost deflated, and the old hat hung low, casting a shadow over the burlap head. When I reached it, I saw something that made my heart pound. The scarecrow's wooden post, the one I'd driven deep into the ground, was torn up, lying on its side, and the scarecrow was barely propped against a tree. The ground around it was disturbed, like something had been dragged. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, and I took a step back, my chest tightening. I turned around, my eyes sweeping the field. The farmhouse stood silent, the windows dark. Everything was quiet now, except for the faint clucking of the chickens. I felt exposed, out there in the open, like there were eyes on me from somewhere in the trees. My heart was racing, and I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was working myself up for nothing. But the footprints were real. The scarecrow had been moved. Someone, or something, had been out here, and it was big, too big to be human. I took another step back, my breath coming faster, my eyes darting to the tree line again. Still nothing, just the cold, still morning, and the shadows stretching out from the trees. I didn't waste any more time. I turned and walked back to the house, my steps quick and uneven. I could feel my pulse in my ears, and my fingers felt numb, even though I was clenching my fists so tightly my nails dug into my palms. When I reached the porch, I grabbed the old shotgun that I kept just inside the door, loading it with shaking hands. I wasn't taking any chances. Whatever was out there, I wasn't about to let it get any closer to the house. I locked the door behind me, double-checking the bolt, and walked to the window that faced the field. The scarecrow was still there, slumped against the tree, and the yard was empty. But I kept watching, my heart pounding. The shotgun resting across my lap. Time seemed to crawl by. The sky grew lighter, the sun starting to rise, casting long shadows across the yard. My eyes burned from staring out the window, but I didn't look away. Every rustle of wind, every creak of the house settling made me jump, my hands tightening around the shotgun. Hours passed, and nothing happened. The chickens eventually calmed down, the clucking fading into quiet pecks and soft noises. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting. I kept glancing at the scarecrow, the way it was slumped, the way its head seemed to droop further as the wind tugged at it. I knew I couldn't stay in the house forever. I needed to figure out what had happened, who had been out there, but the idea of going back into that field, of standing out there alone, made my skin crawl. I decided I'd wait until afternoon, until the sun was high and the shadows were short. Maybe then I'd feel brave enough to go check again. The day dragged on, the sunlight pouring in through the windows, warming the house, but I still felt cold. I finally stood up, the shotgun still in my hands, and walked to the door. I took a deep breath, my stomach churning, and opened it, stepping out onto the porch. The air was still, the sky clear and blue, but the field looked wrong somehow, too quiet, too empty. I started walking, My eyes locked on the scarecrow, my heart pounding. Each step felt heavy, my boots sinking into the soft ground, the shotgun weighing down my arms. The scarecrow looked even worse in the daylight. Its head was slumped over completely, the burlap torn, straw sticking out in uneven clumps. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. When I reached it, I knelt down, my eyes on the ground, tracing the footprints again. They led from the tree line, stopping at the scarecrow, and then nothing. They just stopped. There were no prints leading away. No sign of which direction whoever, or whatever, had gone. It was like it had just vanished. I stood up, my chest tight, and looked around, my eyes scanning the trees, the field, the house. Everything was quiet, but it didn't feel right. I couldn't explain it. Couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, that there was something I wasn't seeing. I turned back to the scarecrow, my fingers brushing against the torn burlap, and that's when I noticed it. The hat. It wasn't the old, beat-up hat I'd put on the scarecrow. It was different, newer, darker, almost like it belonged to someone. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I looked at the tree line again, the shadows deep under the trees, and for a second I thought I saw something move. Just a flicker of dark against dark, there and then gone. I didn't wait. I turned and walked back to the house, my hands shaking, my skin prickling with that feeling that I was being watched. The shotgun was heavy in my arms, but I held it tight, my eyes darting around, my breath coming fast. I didn't look back at the scarecrow. I didn't want to see if it was still slumped there, or if it was standing, or if it was gone. When I got back to the house, I locked the door behind me, bolting it and sliding the deadbolt into place. I moved to the window, the one that faced the field, and stood there, watching. The scarecrow was still there, the hat still tilted to the side, the shadows growing longer as the afternoon sun began to fade. I stayed there until night fell, the darkness creeping in, swallowing the field, the scarecrow disappearing into the shadows. I knew I wouldn't sleep that night. I knew I'd be standing there, watching, waiting, the shotgun heavy in my hands. And I knew one thing for sure. Something had been out there. Something had been in my field. And it wasn't done with me yet. Story 23. It was supposed to be a straightforward hike through the snow, a clear day, blue sky above, and nothing but the crunch of snow underfoot. But that day turned into something else entirely when I heard that sound echoing through the valley. My name's Patrick, and I enjoy winter hikes. There's something about the solitude, the crispness of the air, the way the snow covers everything and makes the world seem clean. I was out there alone, trekking through a valley that was as beautiful as it was remote. I had my snowshoes on, a backpack with some snacks, and a flask of hot tea. The sky above was that kind of pale, washed-out blue you only see in winter, the sun low, casting long shadows across the ground. I had been walking for a couple of hours, just following the gentle curves of the valley, the snow piled high on either side, making the trail feel like my own private path. The air was so cold, it stung my lungs when I breathed in, but I liked it. It made me feel alive, sharp. Everything was quiet. Just the occasional creak of branches under the weight of the snow, or the muffled rustle of some animal darting through the underbrush. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it, a long, drawn-out scream. It wasn't a human scream, but it wasn't an animal I could identify either. It was deep and loud, a sound that seemed to echo through the valley, bouncing off the snowy hills. I stopped walking, my heart thumping hard in my chest, my breath catching in my throat. I listened, straining my ears for anything else. Nothing, just silence again, the kind of silence that seemed heavier than before, pressing in on me. I looked around, turning slowly, trying to see if anything was moving, if there was something that could have made that noise. The snow was untouched, just the trail of my own footprints behind me, disappearing into the distance. I took a breath, trying to calm myself. It could have been anything. An animal. Maybe something far off that just sounded closer because of the way the valley amplified it. But there was something in the pit of my stomach, this uneasy feeling that told me to be careful. I kept walking, but I was more aware now, my senses heightened. Every crunch of snow under my feet felt too loud, every breath too sharp. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my eyes darting to the trees lining the edge of the valley, looking for any movement, anything out of place. The sun was sinking lower, the shadows growing longer, stretching across the snow like dark fingers. Another sound, this time closer. A low, guttural noise, almost like a growl, but not quite. It had a wet, gurgling quality to it, and it sent a jolt of fear through me. I turned my head quickly, my pulse spiking, scanning the trees behind me. I could feel my chest tightening, my hands clenching into fists, the cold biting into my bare fingers. Nothing moved, but I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel it, that heavy feeling of being watched, like eyes were on me, tracking my every step. My skin prickled, a shiver running down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I tried to swallow, my throat dry, my breath coming in short puffs of steam. I didn't know what to do. Running felt wrong, like it would provoke whatever was out there, but staying felt even worse. My brain was screaming at me to move, to get out of that valley before the sun dipped below the hills and the darkness swallowed everything. I turned, picking up my pace, my eyes locked on the trail ahead. I could hear my heart pounding, could feel the weight of my backpack pressing against my shoulders. I tried to focus on my steps, on getting back to where I had parked, where the road cut through the edge of the forest, but the silence was too deep now, the valley too empty, and every step felt like I was being pulled further into something I couldn't escape. The scream came again, echoing through the valley, louder, closer. It made my ears ring, my whole body stiffening in fear. I stopped, my breath caught in my throat, and turned, the snow crunching under my boots as I spun around. There, in the distance, I saw something move, a dark shape against the white snow, tall, shifting between the trees at the far edge of the valley. My blood ran cold, my hands shaking as I fumbled to pull my binoculars from my pack. I raised them to my eyes, my fingers slipping on the focus wheel, my breath fogging the lenses for a second before I got a clear view. It was there, a tall figure, covered in dark fur, standing just at the edge of the trees, half hidden behind a trunk. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, staring across the valley, unblinking. My stomach twisted, and I could feel my legs wanting to move, to run. But I was frozen, my eyes locked on that figure. It shifted again, taking a step out from behind the tree, and I saw just how big it was, easily taller than any man, broad, its shoulders massive, the fur dark and matted. It moved slowly, almost deliberately, like it knew I was watching. I didn't wait to see any more. I dropped the binoculars, letting them hang from the strap around my neck, and turned, my heart pounding so hard I could barely think. I started walking, then jogging, my breath coming in sharp gasps, my feet slipping in the snow as I tried to keep my balance. The fear was like a weight pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe, my eyes darting back and forth, looking for the trail, for anything that would lead me out. I could hear it now, behind me, the crunch of snow, heavy footfalls, the kind that made the ground seem to shake. It was following me. I didn't dare look back, didn't want to see how close it was, didn't want to see those dark eyes staring at me, closing the distance. My legs burned, my throat raw from the cold air, but I pushed on. My hands clenched around the straps of my backpack, my mind focused on one thing, getting out. I stumbled, nearly falling, my knee hitting the snow hard, pain shooting up my leg. I scrambled back up, my heart racing, fear driving me forward, ignoring the throbbing pain. The valley was opening up now, the edge of the forest visible, the line of trees that marked where I had started. I could see my car, parked off to the side, half buried in the snow, and a rush of hope filled me, pushing me forward. I could still hear it, the footsteps behind me, steady, relentless, but I didn't look back. I reached the car, my hands shaking as I yanked the door open, throwing myself inside. I slammed the door shut, locking it, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my chest heaving. I grabbed the keys from my pocket, my fingers fumbling, almost dropping them before I shoved them into the ignition, twisting hard. The engine roared to life, the sound echoing through the stillness, and I hit the gas, the tires spinning for a second before they caught, the car lurching forward. I didn't look back. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles ached, my whole body trembling. I drove, the trees whipping past, the snow-covered road winding down, away from the valley, away from whatever had been there. I don't know how far I drove before I finally let myself breathe, before the fear started to ease, just a little. My hands were still shaking, my heart still racing, but I was out, I was away, and that was all that mattered. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something there, something dark and tall, but there was nothing. Just the empty road, the trees swaying in the breeze, the sun dipping lower in the sky. I've thought about that day a lot since then, replayed every moment, every sound. I don't know what I saw, and maybe I don't want to know. All I know is that something was there, something that shouldn't have been, something that followed me, that wanted me to know I was in its territory. I haven't gone back to that valley. I stick to trails I know, places where there are other people, where the silence doesn't feel so heavy, so wrong. But even now, sometimes, I hear that scream in my dreams, that deep echoing sound, and I feel that same cold fear all over again. Whatever it was, it's still out there, and I never want to be that close to it again. Story 24. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a quick look around an old abandoned cabin. But what I found there wasn't just dust and broken wood, it was something I never wanted to find in a place like that. My name is Lucas, and I've always had a weird fascination with old abandoned places. There's something about them that makes me want to explore, to see what's left behind. This cabin was one I'd heard about from a friend, tucked away deep in the woods, a relic of the old logging days. It was supposed to be empty, just another forgotten building, perfect for an afternoon of exploring, a way to kill some time before the sun set. I made my way out there in the early afternoon, my backpack slung over my shoulder with some water, a flashlight, and a couple of snacks. The hike wasn't too long, maybe 45 minutes from where I'd parked my car at the edge of the forest. The trail was overgrown, but I didn't mind. It was quiet, just the sound of birds overhead and the crunch of leaves under my boots. When I finally got to the cabin, it looked like I expected, small, run-down, with part of the roof sagging in the middle. The wood was grey with age, and there were patches of moss growing up the sides. The front door was barely hanging on its hinges, tilted at an odd angle. I pushed it open, the hinges groaning loudly, the kind of sound that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. The inside was just as worn as the outside. The floor was covered in leaves and debris, with old, splintered furniture tossed around like someone had been through it in a hurry. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my weight, the air cold and stale. I pulled out my flashlight, shining it around even though there was still enough light coming through the broken windows. The beam cut through the shadows, showing more of the same, broken wood, old stains, nothing out of the ordinary. Then I noticed the marks, deep, jagged scratches along the walls, like something had dragged sharp claws down the wood, gouging it out in long, uneven lines. I felt my stomach tighten a bit, my eyes narrowing as I traced the marks with the beam. They weren't the kind of thing you'd expect to see here. It wasn't the damage of weather or time. These were deliberate, forceful. I stepped closer, running my fingers over the grooves, feeling the rough edges. They were deep, deep enough that I could feel the splinters pricking my skin. It made me uneasy, like someone or something had been in here. Angry. I shook it off, taking a breath and telling myself it was probably just some animal, maybe a bear, though something about that didn't feel right. I moved further into the cabin, pushing open a door that led to what must have been a small bedroom. The bed frame was broken, leaning against the wall, and the window was shattered, letting in a cold breeze that made the old curtains flutter slightly. That's when I heard it, a low sound, almost like a whisper, coming from somewhere outside. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing up, my ears straining to hear it again. The whisper wasn't natural, it wasn't the wind or the trees creaking. It sounded deliberate, like a voice, but it was too faint to make out any words. My mouth went dry and I turned slowly, shining the flashlight back towards the main room of the cabin. Nothing, just empty space. The light catching on the dust, hanging in the air. I took a step back, my pulse starting to pick up, a tightness forming in my chest. The whisper came again, this time a little louder, like it was coming from right outside the window. I turned my head quickly, catching sight of a shadow passing by, tall, dark, moving too smoothly to be an animal. My heart jumped into my throat, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I backed up, my shoulders hitting the wall, the flashlight beam bouncing around wildly as my hands shook. I didn't want to be here anymore. I pushed away from the wall, turning back towards the main room, my eyes darting to the door. As I moved, I heard a soft creak, like a floorboard shifting under weight. It was coming from the other side of the wall, just outside the cabin. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound, trying to listen. The creak came again, closer, the slow, deliberate sound of something moving around the cabin, circling it. I swallowed, my throat dry, and started moving towards the door, each step careful, quiet, my boots barely making a sound on the old wooden floor. I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples, my breaths shallow, each one a struggle to keep steady. I reached the door, my hand on the edge, and slowly pushed it open, the creak echoing through the empty cabin. The clearing outside was empty, just the trees standing still, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. But I could feel it, the sense of something being there, just out of sight, just beyond the edge of the clearing. I stepped out onto the porch, my flashlight flicking back and forth, trying to catch any movement. The whisper came again, this time from the tree line, clearer, like a voice, but still too low for me to understand. I turned towards it, my hands trembling, the light shaking slightly. For a split second I saw it, a shape, tall, covered in dark fur, standing just beyond the first line of trees. It moved, slipping behind a trunk, disappearing before I could really get a good look. That was enough for me. My fear broke loose, my instincts kicking in. I turned and ran, my feet pounding on the uneven ground, the flashlight beam bouncing with every step. I didn't care about being careful, didn't care if I tripped. I just needed to get away from that cabin, away from whatever was out there. I crashed through the underbrush, branches scratching at my arms and face, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whisper was gone, but I could still feel that presence, still feel like I was being watched, like something was right behind me, just out of sight. My legs burned, my chest aching as I pushed on, the path twisting ahead of me, the trees thickening, the light fading. When I finally saw my car, parked at the edge of the forest, I almost cried with relief. I stumbled towards it, my fingers fumbling with the keys, dropping them once before I managed to get the door open. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut, locking it, my breath coming in sharp gasps, my whole body trembling. I started the engine, the sound breaking the silence, and backed out quickly, the tires skidding on the dirt. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if anything was standing at the edge of the forest, watching me leave. I just drove, the road winding away from the trees, away from that cabin, my heart pounding, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. It wasn't until I was miles away, until the forest was just a dark line in the rearview mirror, that I finally let out a shaky breath, the tension easing slightly, my muscles relaxing. I kept my eyes on the road, my mind still racing, replaying every sound, every shadow. I don't know what was out there, what made those marks, what whispered my name, but I know one thing: I'm not going back to that cabin. Whatever is out there, it doesn't want visitors, and I'm more than happy to stay away.